1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. These so-called grinning birds were synonymous with the company's self-promoting ad campaign about them being the world's friendliest airline. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. As a result, the men inside of the Cessna did not take it upon themselves to actively begin looking for this jet. They assumed the pilots of PSA 182, who had them in sight, would avoid them. Back in PSA 182, there seemed to be some confusion in the cockpit. The two pilots were debating whether the Cessna they were watching fly lower than them, past them on the right, was the same Cessna that air traffic control had told them about. And at some point they agreed, yep, that's got to be the same Cessna. And so they called in to air traffic control that it looks like the Cessna has passed us. They've flown past us on the right. Immediately after this transmission, the black box recorded the two pilots talking to each other, basically trying to convince the other that yes, that was definitely the right Cessna. But after a couple of minutes of reassuring themselves, one of them says, boy, I hope that was the right Cessna. According to later testimony by the air traffic controller who was in communication with the pilots of PSA 182 as they were on their final descent, he would say when Captain McFerrin came over and said the Cessna has passed him on the right, he believed him and he didn't think to check to make sure it was the right one. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. The real Cessna they were supposed to maintain visual separation with, the one containing Casey and Boswell, was still ascending in the direct flight path of PSA 182, except now this Cessna is in 182's blind spot below their nose, so they literally can't see each other. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft. Instead, this controller only contacted the Cessna and didn't tell them this was a dire situation. They said, hey, there's traffic in your vicinity, but I'm pretty sure it's just PSA 182 and they already see you, so you're fine. So Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section containing David Boswell plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. Inside of PSA 182, this explosion was deafening, and immediately after it, McFerrin was recorded saying, easy baby, easy baby. Then he asks Fox, what's the damage? And Fox says, it's bad, man, we're hit. Despite trying to keep the plane flying level, it lurched forward into an unrecoverable nosedive, and McFerrin, knowing they were doomed, calmly calls out to air traffic control and says, we're going down. Air traffic responded, okay, we'll have the equipment ready for you. Then the black box recorded the sound of a stall warning inside the cockpit, and as the aircraft streaked at over 300 miles per hour straight towards the ground, McFerrin's last known transmission to air traffic was, this is it, baby. Seconds before impact, McFerrin gave his final command over the intercom, which was brace yourselves, and then right before the black box cut out, someone in the cabin yelled, "I love you, Mom." At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. Almost immediately, firefighters were rushing towards the rising mushroom cloud of black, oily smoke, and many of the first responders that arrived at the crash site in those first few hours were deeply disturbed at what they saw. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the mid-air collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible because there was that moment that was picked up in the black box where the 2 pilots were unsure if the Cessna that passed them was the right one, but instead of calling that into air traffic control and getting confirmation, they blew it off. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event when he heard the explosion overhead, which was 182 colliding with the Cessna, and he began taking pictures, and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182 seconds before they hit the ground. So that's going to do it. 25th, 2017, a 25-year-old farmer named Akbar Solabiro was harvesting palm fruit at the local oil palm grove near his tiny village in Indonesia. Now, the way Akbar would do this is he would use this long curved pole and he would prod at the bright red fruit in the tree, knocking it to the ground, and then he would gather it up, put it in his cart, and wheel it back home to be sold for palm oil. Now, on this night, Akbar was actually working later than usual because his wife and kids were out of town for a couple of days visiting family, and so there was no real reason to head back home because the house was empty. But Akbar was actually just fine with that because there was tons of ripe fruit, and so staying late would be quite profitable. But after a while, when the sun had finally set and it was getting difficult to actually even see the fruit in the tree, Akbar knew he really needed to leave soon because this area at night was actually not safe. And so Akbar gathered up the remainder of his fruit on the ground, he put his pole in the cart as well, and he began quickly making his way back home. Later that evening, one of Akbar's neighbors was asleep in their bed inside of their home when they woke up suddenly to the sound of something out in the jungle, not far from where Akbar had been harvesting palm fruit. And so this neighbor, when they sat up, they couldn't really tell what the sound was. It almost sounded like a stifled scream or maybe some animal that was fighting with another animal. But as the neighbor sat there straining their ears to try to hear it again, they didn't. All they heard was normal sounds coming from the outside. And so the neighbor decided that the sound they heard must have been a cat or maybe a monkey, and whatever it was, it couldn't have been a big deal. And so this neighbor went back to sleep. The following evening, so 24 hours later, another one of Akbar's neighbors walked outside of their home to begin the walk over to the jungle to harvest palm fruit. And when they went outside, normally around this time, Akbar would be coming outside as well, because these two often went to the grove together. But, this neighbor is looking and Akbar's not outside, and he looks up at Akbar's house and it's dark and quiet. And so this neighbor's thinking to themselves, where is Akbar? I know he worked late last night. I didn't hear him come in. And come to think of it, I haven't seen him all day. And now, of course, I'm not seeing him as well. And so this neighbor, feeling concerned about Akbar, walked over and knocked on his door, but nobody answered. And so really starting to think that something could be wrong with Akbar, this neighbor went to Akbar's uncle's house. And when Akbar's uncle came to the door, this neighbor explained what was going on and they're concerned that, something could have happened to Akbar. And so the uncle and this neighbor would go back over to Akbar's home and they would actually try the door. It was locked. They looked inside the windows and it looked like no one was in there. And they also noticed that where Akbar typically kept his cart that he would transport his fruit in, it wasn't there either, which made them think, Akbar must still be out somewhere with this cart because this cart is very important to him. And so ultimately, the uncle, after seeing the state of his nephew's home, he agreed with this neighbor that, something was wrong here. And if they wanted to find Akbar, they really needed to get together a search party right now and go looking for him. So the uncle contacted the leaders of the village, and they in turn rounded up all the able-bodied men in the village, and they all got together with headlamps and flashlights and machetes and knives, and then all together they began walking away from the village into the jungle in the direction of this palm grove, which was the place that Akbar had been last. And so this big group of men, they get inside the jungle and they begin walking along this path, which was the most likely path that Akbar would have taken to go to the palm grove and also to return from the palm grove. And as they're walking, the sun is starting to set, it's getting dark, and the animals in the jungle, they're all making noises and kind of yelling at this group as they're moving through. And this group, they're shining their light around looking for any sign of Akbar, but there wasn't any. They were calling his name out, there was no response. And then at some point, as they got closer to the palm grove, they noticed there were a couple of bright red fruits, palm fruits, that had clearly been recently harvested that were scattered on the trail. And so the group began to fan out in this area, thinking that, oh my goodness, Akbar must be somewhere nearby. Maybe there was some sort of accident and he's fallen somewhere, or just something's happened to him, but he's got to be in this area. And so the group began fanning out off the trail, kind of hacking their way through all the underbrush. And then suddenly, one of the men, after he hacked through a particularly dense stretch of the jungle, he looked down and saw something and began to scream, and he raised his machete and began running forward. As far as we can tell, this is what happened to Akbar. The previous night, after Akbar had decided, it wasn't safe to be in the jungle at night, he needed to leave, and so he gathered up all of his things and he began walking along that path where the search party would find all that fruit scattered on the trail. And so he's walking along this path and he thinks he's alone, he thinks he's okay, but in reality, he wasn't. He was being watched and followed very closely from something up in the trees. And so as Akbar moved along, this thing was kind of trailing him and seeing what he was going to do. And then at some point, this thing up in the trees began moving its way down closer and closer to Akbar. It was a 23-foot long reticulated python. It was a massive snake. And this snake came down and launched an attack on Akbar, grabbing the back of his neck with its powerful jaws. And as soon as the snake clamped down on Akbar's neck, he let out a stifled scream, which was the scream that had woken up that other neighbor who sat up in bed wondering what that was. That was Akbar screaming out. But that was the only sound Akbar could make, because immediately the snake wrapped itself all around Akbar and squeezed him tight. And after crushing Akbar, breaking almost every bone in his body, the snake relaxed and then slithered off of Akbar. And so Akbar fell to the ground and was either dead or very close to death. And at this point, the snake opened up its jaws and positioned itself right in front of Akbar's head. And then it began kind of slithering itself forward, consuming Akbar head first. And the way pythons do this is they don't really chew on their victim. Instead, they kind of put their mouth over the top of whatever they're going to consume, and they kind of undulate and walk their bodies forward, driving the victim deeper and deeper into their body until they are completely consumed. And so the next night, when one of the members of the search party had gone off the trail and began hacking away and then saw something and charged after it with his machete, what he was seeing was the python, who very clearly, of February 19th, 2022, a 41-year-old woman named Paula Ruiz was working the reception desk at a 4-star hotel in southern Mexico. It had been a long Saturday night with lots of tourists checking in and lots of confused tourists asking for directions or clarifications about things in the area. But it was finally nearing 11 p.m., which was the end of Paula's shift, and also things had calmed down near the reception desk. There wasn't much going on. And so Paula took a moment and grabbed her phone and checked it. And she saw there was a text message from her 19-year-old son saying he would be picking her up after work on his motorbike. And then just a couple of minutes later, Miguel, her son, actually walked in the front door of the hotel. He waved to his mom and said, hey, I parked my motorbike just down the street. Whenever you're ready, we can leave. And so Paula, she was very happy to see her son. She walked over, she gave him a kiss and a hug, and then she began gathering her things. Paula loved the fact that her son was totally comfortable driving around town with his mom on the back of his motorcycle. Other teenagers might think that was awkward, but not Miguel. But Paula knew her son absolutely loved his motorbike and basically was always looking for an excuse to ride it. And so very likely that was why he was so eager to give his mom a ride home. And so finally, after Paula had gathered up her things and said goodbye to her coworkers, she and her son walked out the front doors of the hotel, and they began walking down the road and around the corner to where Miguel always parked his bike whenever he picked his mom up from work. However, when they turned the corner and looked at the spot where Miguel said he had parked, his bike wasn't there. Now, at first, Paula asked Miguel, are you sure you parked it here? Maybe did you park it farther down the road? But Miguel said, no, this is where I always park. I definitely parked it right here. And so Miguel became convinced that someone must have stolen his bike. That was the only explanation that made sense. But Miguel still had the keys to his motorcycle, which meant whoever had stolen it had likely hotwired it. And since that takes quite a bit of time to pull off components of the bike and kind of fiddle around with the wires to make it start, Miguel was thinking that, okay, maybe they're still in the area trying to hotwire it. Let's go look for them and get the bike back. Now, the city in southern Mexico where Paula and Miguel lived was called San Cristobal de las Casas, and it was a totally beautiful place surrounded by all these hills, but it was also a very dangerous place, full of lots of street crime and violence and gangs that used the area as a hotspot for drug trafficking. And so this is not really a good place to be walking around at night, let alone trying to chase down some bike thief. But Paula and Miguel, they knew this. They lived there. They understood the risks. And Paula especially, she knew that Miguel was going to go looking for this bike because he loved that bike. And so Paula didn't hesitate and said, okay, Miguel, let's go looking. And she figured at a minimum, she could take a video or a picture of the thief if they found them with the bike, and then they could give that to police, and then maybe they could track the person down if Miguel and Paula couldn't get the bike back that night. And so Paula and Miguel began running down these side streets, looking all over the place for Miguel's bike. And you got to picture some narrow alleyways with barely any lighting. I mean, this is a sketchy area. And so they're running around, and then finally they turn a corner and Miguel sees up ahead his distinctive yellow motorbike, and he sees some stranger is pushing it along. Clearly this person is pushing it away so they can hotwire it. And so Miguel and Paula begin charging down the road, and Miguel actually gets in front of this guy and stops him, and Miguel starts screaming at the guy to give him his bike back. And then Paula, she joins her son and she starts screaming at him as well and taking videos and pictures. And then as this is happening, another man on a motorbike came flying up behind Paula and Miguel. And as they did, Paula and Miguel heard the sound of the engine and they turned around, and all Paula saw was this young man holding a gun, aiming it at her son, Miguel, right at his chest. And so her motherly instincts kicked in and she leapt in front of her son, and then not knowing what else to do, she raised her phone and took a picture. And then seconds later, there was a loud bang, and then suddenly this guy who had been trying to steal Miguel's bike gave it up. He dropped the bike, he took off running down the road, and the gunman, he too turned his bike around and sped off down the road, leaving Miguel and Paula in the alleyway. Except Paula was on the ground because a second after she took that photo, the gunman had shot her in the chest. Paula would be taken to the hospital, but she would die the following morning, orphaning Miguel and his 3 siblings. However, the photo that Paula took of her killer seconds before he killed her was such a high quality photo showing his face that just 2 days after her murder, police were able to use that photo to find the killer as well as his accomplice, and they were both arrested. February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Mishe Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress, and immediately Mishe knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done. And so Mishe, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress and thanked her mom for all the hard work and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Misha, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss. And she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast, she finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye, and then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school, like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, "What's going on? What are you looking at back there?" And Misha's aunt would say, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school." And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road, so it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious. And so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, "I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us." A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt. She thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy, and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile, and then quickly looked away from Misha, and then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared, and she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time. They shared everything with each other. And certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally, they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first, and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already 2 people inside who she didn't recognize. It was 2 women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the 2 women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the 2 women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, what photo are you talking about and really what's going on here, these two women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them and you can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the two women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office and they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug. And it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the two women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the two women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said, okay. And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the two women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the two social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the two women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house. And Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the three of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper. and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station, where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there, stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse. Which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly, and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things, and looked so dramatically similar, is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew, that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. And so they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, LaVonna Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that LaVonna's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped, because 17 years earlier, LaVonna had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and LaVonna did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany, when in reality, after LaVonna had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that LaVonna had stitched for her to her high school dance, well after the news came out about who LaVonna was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany. In the 1980s, significant volcanic activity began to occur all over Mount St. Helens in Washington state. The north face of the mountain had begun to visibly shake, and then by March 27th, there was steam coming out of the craters and vents all over the north side of the mountain. That April, scientists began to notice that there was this massive bulge that was growing on the north side of this mountain that was about a mile in diameter, and every day it was growing about 6 feet farther and farther up the mountain. And it was basically this massive undercurrent of magma that was going towards the top of the mountain, getting ready to explode. Initially, there was some speculation that perhaps this magma bulge is not nearly as big of a deal as people are making it out to be, that really at worst it could be a small eruption and it would have no impact on the surrounding areas. But authorities became skittish and were worried that they could just be caught with their pants down if this turned into a full-blown volcanic eruption. So they began evacuating the area. And for the most part, everybody evacuated, with the exception of a few scientists and some photographers and some really hardcore people that did not want to leave their homes. One of those people who had stayed behind was Robert Landsberg, who was a photographer, and on May 18th, 1980, he was out hiking about 7 miles away from the summit of Mount St. Helens, and he was making his way up to try to find a good viewpoint of that north face. He wanted to look at that magma surge that was making its way up on the north side of the mountain. And so finally he makes his way up and he gets to a great spot and he starts taking pictures of that north face. While Robert is taking pictures of that side of the mountain, a 5.2 magnitude earthquake struck the area, causing that entire north face of Mount St. Helens to be sheared off and begin falling down the side of the mountain. It's this massive landslide. It's one of the biggest that's ever been recorded in that area. But what it really did is all of a sudden that entire magma surge that had been building up underneath on the north side, making its way up, suddenly is uncovered, and it causes this massive volcanic explosion shooting 15 miles straight up into the air. Along with this massive vertical blast, there was a simultaneous lateral blast basically pointed directly at Robert, and it sent these molten debris surging down the mountainside at 100 miles an hour or faster. Robert knew he had no hope of escaping this wall of magma and ash coming straight at him. So he decides, instead of trying to save myself, I'm going to take as many pictures as I can of this volcanic eruption, and then I'm going to try to protect the film. And so Robert took as many pictures as he could of this massive volcanic wall of death coming towards him until the very last second when he puts his camera into his bag, he puts that into his backpack, and then he holds it against his chest and lays down on the ground using his body as the last protective measure to try to save this film for posterity. 17 days later, they find Robert Landsberg's body, and sure enough, he was able to protect his film by laying on top of it. And so they developed the pictures that he took, and they're incredible. Here are the final pictures that Robert Landsberg took before he was killed by the volcano. 2014, Darsh Patel, who was a 22-year-old college student, was out hiking in a New Jersey state park along with 5 of his college buddies. As they were about to head down a particular trail that they had actually gone to this park to go down, a man and woman come charging up the path towards them. And so Darsh and his friends stop, and they're looking at these 2 people who look totally distraught and scared. And the man and woman immediately say, "Hey, don't go down this path. We were just down there, and for the past 10 minutes, a black bear has been stalking us in the tree line. We don't know where it went, but we got up here, we turned around and it was gone, but we would not suggest going down this path. It's just not worth it." Darsh and his friends tell the couple, "Thank you for giving us the heads up. We were actually going to go down that path, and so I guess now we won't." And so the couple, they quickly leave, and Darsh and his friends are sitting there thinking, well, now what do we do? Because this was the trail we were going to go down. This is why we're here. As they're standing there, they start talking about, well, maybe we just go down anyways. There's 6 of us. I highly doubt that a bear is going to come out of the woods and attack 6 people, especially a black bear that is not known to attack people. Why don't we just walk down a ways, and if we see the bear, then we just turn around and leave. And if we see the bear, might make some good pictures. Let's just go down there and see what happens." And they start walking. And sure enough, about 10 minutes into their trip down this trail, they see this massive bear parked right in the center of the trail about 250 meters away from where they were. The bear did not appear to be doing anything. It was just sitting there, but it was clearly looking at the group of them. So Darsh and his friends are just standing there, not really sure what to do, so they start taking pictures and videos. They're not moving any closer, but they just start documenting what they're seeing because this bear was apparently stalking this couple. It was pretty interesting, and they figured, hey, make some good pictures. So they start taking pictures and taking some videos of this animal, and the animal starts walking towards them. Now, it's 250 meters away. They recognize that this is a dangerous animal, and we don't want to get too close to it, but they felt relatively safe. Even if it started moving towards them initially, they still felt safe. But the animal starts jogging towards them. At this point, the boys put their phones away, turn around, and they start hightailing it the other way. And somebody looks back and notices the bear is now sprinting at them. This causes the group to completely panic. They start sprinting back towards where their cars were parked. Absolute full panic back up the trail. No one's paying attention to anybody else. They're just running for their lives. And as they're turning their heads to look, the bear is gaining on them and gaining on them. Finally, after about 10 minutes of just running for their lives, they make it to the parking lot and they turn around. There's no bear, but there's short one hiker. Darsh Patel is still in the forest somewhere. The group starts screaming for Darsh. They know there was this aggressive bear in there chasing them, so they're obviously worried about him potentially getting attacked, and so they immediately call 911. The police show up and park rangers show up, and they go into the forest to try to find this bear and to find Darsh. And very quickly they come across this bear in a clearing, this 300-pound bear all by itself, aggressively pacing around this lump in the middle of this clearing that had sticks and branches on it. It wasn't clear what it was, and this bear is just pacing in a circle around this thing. And as these two park rangers get closer, they're armed. The bear looks at them and makes a move like it's going to charge, and they elect to shoot and kill this bear. Later, the bear's remains would be taken to a laboratory, and inside of the bear's stomach was Darsh Patel. He had been killed and eaten by this bear, and that lump that was on the ground that the bear was circling was whatever was left of Darsh that had not been consumed yet. When they recovered Darsh Patel's phone, they went into his images and they found he had taken one final picture before he was attacked. Here it is. The bear was not malnourished, it was not diseased, it just decided it wanted to stalk, kill, and eat a human astronaut who in 1967 was scheduled to orbit the Earth in the first manned flight of a particular Soviet spacecraft called the Soyuz. Komarov would be flying this mission solo, and so he needed a backup in case for some reason he couldn't go. And his backup was Yuri Gagarin, who was actually Komarov's best friend. This mission was very important to the Soviet Union, more from a political standpoint, but nonetheless, the pressure was on Komarov to successfully complete this mission. And so he, along with his backup, Yuri, had to train extra hard and make sure they did not screw this up. But it turns out the fail point for this mission was almost certainly not going to be Komarov or Gagarin if he ended up going instead of Komarov. It was going to be the spaceship itself. Gagarin, along with a host of engineers, did a full-blown inspection of the Soyuz and found 203 significant structural problems, and they all recommended postponement of this mission. But their recommendation was ignored because, again, this mission was so politically important to the Soviet Union that they were effectively ready to risk their astronauts to make it happen. When Komarov found out about all these structural issues and the fact that the powers that be were not even listening and were basically saying, we don't care, you're doing this mission anyways, he was crushed. And he told a KGB agent that he was certain he was going to die. And this KGB agent would later say that he asked Komarov, well then why don't you refuse the mission? And Komarov said, if I refuse the mission, they're going to make my best friend go and he'll die up there, so I have to go. Gagarin pleaded with Komarov to relinquish the role, let Gagarin go instead of him, but Komarov was staunch. He said, I've been given this mission, I'm going to go, you're going to stay here. But what Komarov did, which is so legendary, is he made sure his funeral, if he were to die in the course of this mission, would be open casket. Because he knew if he came back to Earth, it was probably going to be because this spaceship has crashed, and he wanted the Soviet leadership to see what they had done. So sure enough, Komarov gets in the Soyuz on launch day, he takes off, and the problems began almost immediately. They had very little power, they had limited communications with the ground, and the craft itself was spinning uncontrollably. Seeing how badly it was going already, Soviet leadership on the ground instructed Komarov to nix the mission and just try to come back to Earth. For 5 hours, Komarov circled Earth and attempted to re-enter Earth's atmosphere, but his ship, because of all of those structural problems, didn't work. And so 18 times he attempts to re-enter Earth's atmosphere, but each time it fails. And it was around this time that American intelligence recorded a conversation between a high-ranking Soviet leader on the ground and Komarov. And the leader on the ground is basically crying and saying they're so sorry to Komarov and that he's going to be a hero. They got his wife to come on, and his wife is talking to Komarov, and Komarov's telling her, what to do with the kids, what to do with his estate. He's perfectly fine and healthy, but the craft is doomed, and everybody knows it. Then that call ends, and Komarov, on his 19th attempt, is able to re-enter Earth's atmosphere, which everyone was pretty surprised he could even do that, but his parachutes failed. As Komarov is plunging to his death, over the radio he's cursing the Soviet leadership that doomed him by putting him in a botched spaceship. And so sure enough, on April 24th around 7 a.m., Komarov's craft smashes into the ground, killing Komarov, And when they open it up, it's clear what happened to him. He didn't die on impact. He basically burned alive inside of this capsule as it was careening down towards the Earth. And so all that's left of him is this charred pile. But because Komarov explicitly stated that they had to have an open casket funeral, specifically because he wanted the Soviet leadership to see what they had done to him, they had to hold an open casket funeral with just these charred remains. And here is the famous picture of Komarov's funeral, where the actual Soviet leaders that put him in that spaceship that was doomed. Here they are, viewing his open casket funeral. In 1975, a criminal who had been dubbed the Visayala Ransacker had been terrorizing the Eastern District of Sacramento, California. Initially, he would break into people's homes when they were sleeping by prying open one of their windows. He would go inside and basically ransack their house. He wouldn't steal any of the major valuables that were right in plain sight. He would just kind of throw things all over the place and would take one or two small things, probably as a souvenir. Unfortunately, by the summer of 1976, this Visayala ransacker was not only not caught, but was also no longer satisfied with just breaking into people's homes and ransacking them and taking a few things. He had moved on to killing people, and so he had been given a new nickname, one that just about everybody knew at the time, and that was the Golden State Killer. Once he began killing people, he became much more cautious about how he would actually go about attacking them. He would oftentimes break into his victims' homes while they weren't there, and he would walk their property, look for guns and unload them. He would look for any security cameras or devices and turn them off. He would plant ligatures, pieces of rope and twine that he could use to bind people's arms and legs. He would place them in their house, and then he would leave. And he would study his victims and get to know their patterns and know when they were going to be in the house, when they were going to be in certain rooms. And then at some point he would sneak in through a window at night while they were sleeping, and their victims would wake up with him standing over them with a flashlight in their face. On the rare occasion where neighbors or police had actually spotted this guy, they saw that he was wearing a full face mask and he was very athletic. He was able to elude police capture and would jump over fences and would run away. By the end of 1976, when the Golden State Killer had still not been caught, citizens of Sacramento became furious with the police. They felt like they were not doing enough to try to catch this guy. So on November 3rd, 1976, the police actually host this huge town hall meeting, and they invite all the citizens of Sacramento to come be a part of it, voice your complaints, listen to what police are actually trying to do to catch the Golden State Killer, and basically just have an opportunity to air your grievances a little bit. During the meeting, a man in the crowd who was a citizen of Sacramento stands up and basically starts making fun of the Golden State Killer, calling him weak and a coward, saying, you're preying on women. If you ever came to my house, I would totally beat the crap out of you. Like, this guy's a joke. And everybody in the town hall meeting just totally ate it up. It was like this one little victory for the town of Sacramento is we're going to put down the Golden State Killer for being weak and a coward. Then, in an ironic twist of fate, that guy who was making fun of the Golden State Killer, he and his wife became the next victims of the Golden State Killer. And in fact, the Golden State Killer changed his entire MO. Instead of kind of targeting random people all over Sacramento, he began only targeting married couples, and he would always attack when the husband was home. For decades, the Golden State Killer eluded capture and even taunted the police in threatening phone calls all the way up until 2001. But in 2016, they reinvestigated the Golden State Killer case using DNA evidence, something that was not available in the 70s and the 80s when they were investigating these crimes. And it was through this reinvestigation that they were able to capture 74-year-old Joseph DeAngelo in 2018, who was, in fact, the Golden State Killer. DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was given 12 consecutive life sentences. When the killer was finally identified as Joseph DeAngelo, police were going through some of the older case photos and they made a startling discovery. This is a picture from the November 3rd, 1976 town hall meeting, and there in the middle of the photo is none other than Joseph DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer. And he was there when that citizen of Sacramento stood up and began berating the Golden State Killer, saying how he was a coward and weak and that he would totally beat him up if he ever came to his house. And there's Joseph DeAngelo sitting there listening to this guy. And after the meeting, what does he do? He targets the guy that spoke out against him. And even after he attacked this guy, apparently he was so upset that he changed his entire MO and only targeted married couples from that point on, as if he was proving a point that you can't teen. He was skipping school regularly and hanging out with the wrong crowd. Tyler's parents had tried to do everything to get their son back on track, between doctor's visits, psychiatry appointments, medication, an outpatient mental health program, but none of it seemed to work. Tyler just was on the wrong path. As Tyler's behavior continued to get worse as he got older, his parents just didn't know what to do, became very frustrated with him, and became very, very strict disciplinarians. One night when Tyler came home and he appeared to be intoxicated, his parents took his phone and car away, and Tyler was furious. And he confided in his best friend, Michael Mandel, that he thought his parents had gone over the line, that they were over-disciplining him, and he said to Michael that he wanted to kill his mother. Now, Michael knew Tyler and had known him since he was a little kid, and he did not think twice about this claim that, Tyler wanted to kill his mom. He just thought that Tyler was frustrated with his parents, and Michael did know that Tyler's parents were very, very strict and hard on him. So he just kind of wrote it off. Not long after this incident, Tyler starts talking about this huge house party he's going to have. And all of Tyler's friends, including Michael, just didn't buy it. They're like, there's no way you could ever pull this off. Your parents are too strict and they never leave town anyways. But every time people approached him, he would say, oh no, my parents aren't going to be there. They'll never find out. At some point, Michael gets a Facebook invitation to Tyler's big house party, and he sees that it's been sent to so many people. It's been sent well beyond an inner circle of friends to just total strangers. And then on the Facebook invitation itself, someone had posted on the wall, hey Tyler, what are you going to do if your parents come home? And he responded to that, they won't, trust me. On the day of the party, Michael shows up to Tyler's house and it is packed with people. Lots of people he didn't know, and he was fairly certain Tyler didn't know them either. And he goes inside and it's clear that no one gives a crap about the house itself. People are writing on the walls, people have spilled stuff all over the ground, there's broken glass on the ground, people are rummaging through the food in the fridge. No one cared about the house. And Tyler, oddly enough, didn't seem to mind at all. The only time Tyler became on edge was when he felt like the party was getting too loud. And he would go around and tell people to be quiet because he didn't want his neighbors to hear, because the neighbors would call the police and he didn't want the police coming to the house. During this big party, Tyler pulls Michael aside and says, hey, I gotta tell you something, come outside with me. When they get outside, Tyler looks at Mike and just says, Mike, I killed my parents. Michael doesn't believe him, but Tyler says, no, look in my driveway, their car is still here. They did not go to Orlando. I killed my parents. Michael still didn't believe him, and Tyler said, go inside. I bet if you look around, you'll find blood in my house. So he goes inside and he starts looking around, and when he goes upstairs, he sees there's blood on a table right outside the master bedroom where Tyler's parents slept. And on the door handle to the master bedroom, there was also blood. So he goes back down, and he goes, Tyler, you're playing a prank on me. And Tyler goes, no, when the party dies down, I'll show you proof. At this point, Michael is starting to think this could actually be real. And Tyler walks away, and Michael's thinking to himself, I can't wait till the end of this party to see if this is really true or not. So he goes upstairs, goes to the bloody door handle to the master bedroom, opens it up, and the door actually hits the leg of Tyler's father, who's laying on the ground, who's deceased inside of the master bedroom. He shuts the door and he's standing in the hall and he doesn't know what to do, because on the one hand, Tyler's his friend, but he just discovered Tyler's a murderer. He also knew Tyler's parents really well, so he's deeply saddened by what he just saw. And as he's standing there, he's realizing that he has to turn Tyler in. And so for some reason, he just felt the need to take one more picture with Tyler, because he knew as soon as he left the house, he was going to go tell authorities what Tyler had done, and he was never going to see him again. And so he goes over to Tyler and he takes this picture. After Tyler was arrested, he admitted that just hours before this house party, he had bludgeoned his parents to death and stashed them in the master bedroom. Tyler was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and while he has been remorseful, he's never given a real reason why he actually killed. 26-year-old Jodi Arias met 29-year-old Travis Alexander at a big business convention in Las Vegas. The two hit it off immediately, with Travis on the same day he met her inviting Jodi to be his guest at his company's formal dinner that night. After the dinner was over, Travis and Jodi stayed up all night chatting with each other, and the next day, Travis was telling his friends at this convention that he had, quote, found his wife. After the convention was over, Travis and Jodi would continue to see each other, even though it was a long-distance relationship. Travis lived in Arizona and Jodi lived in California. But they would meet up and they would travel and take beautiful pictures and post to social media. It just seemed like they were a dream couple that were so happy together. While the couple's social media posts might have made it seem like they were this perfect couple, Travis's friends began to notice some very strange behavior by Jody early on in their relationship. Jody just seemed totally obsessed with Travis. She could not keep her hands off of him. Travis would be talking to his friends, and Jody would come up beside him and literally grab onto him and cling to him. And Travis would try to push her off of him, and she would just come right back and grab onto him. But it wasn't playful and jokey and funny. It was like she literally needed to be holding on to Travis. Jody would get really upset anytime Travis was interacting with a female. Didn't matter their age or their relationship to Travis. It was like she just could not hack any other females in his life. She would follow Travis anytime he went to the bathroom, and she would put her ear to the door and try to eavesdrop in case there was somebody else in the bathroom that Travis could have been talking to. She began showing up to Travis's house totally unannounced at all hours. And one time when the house was locked and Travis wasn't even home, she snuck into the house through the doggy door. Initially, Travis's friends just thought it was weird behavior, but over time, they started to feel like Jody might actually be dangerous. And so they sat him down one day and they kind of had like an intervention, and they said, "Hey, Travis, there is something off about Jody. Her behavior is just totally weird, and it seems like she is just never gonna let you go. I think you need to break this off and just find a way to cut ties with this woman." As they're speaking to him, they hear something outside of the room they're in, which had all the doors closed. And Travis stands up, walks over, opens the door, and standing right there is Jody. She was eavesdropping, and she was furious. And she looked in at all of them and gave them absolute death stares and stormed off. Shortly after this intervention, Travis takes his friend's advice and he does break it off with Jody, and he kind of moves on with his life. Now remember, he lives in Arizona and Jody lives in California, so you'd think it would be pretty easy to break up because you're never going to run into each other. And that's what Travis was kind of banking on, that he could get a fresh start and never see her again. But about 2 weeks after they broke up, Jody moved to Arizona. Around the same time, Travis starts dating a new woman named Lisa, and almost immediately, Jody starts stalking Lisa, showing up at her house, tapping on her windows and running away. She starts slashing Travis's tires. I mean, she was a total menace. She was trying to break them up. But a few months after she arrived in Arizona, Jody ultimately packs up and heads back to California in April of 2008. And Travis, Lisa, his girlfriend, and all of Travis's friends are so relieved. They felt like now the breakup is final. 2 months after Jody leaves Arizona and goes back to California, Travis misses a really big business meeting. And at first, his friends are calling him and kind of giving him a hard time about missing this meeting, but he wasn't responding. And after a couple of days, his friends decided they needed to go do a welfare check and make sure he really was okay. They go to his house, they open it up, and immediately when they walk in, they see blood on the carpet, and they're calling out for Travis. Travis is nowhere to be found. They walk through the house and they discover in the bathroom Travis's body. He was dead and laying in the tub. They call the police, who come over and immediately suspect Jody Arias, who denies that she was ever there, that she had left, she was in Arizona, that she had nothing to do with this. But during the investigation, they find a camera inside of the washing machine inside of Travis's house. They were able to dry it off and extract the last few pictures that were taken on the camera. The first few pictures are of Jody herself. She's clearly inside of Travis's house. And then at some point she goes into the bathroom where Travis was. He's taking a shower. She takes this picture, and then immediately following this picture, she proceeds to stab Travis to death. In May of 2013, Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in jail. The Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia was starting to show signs of significant activity. The tremors had become so powerful that the citizens of a nearby town called Amero, that was home to 31,000 people, they started to become very concerned. You know, if this thing were to go off, we're only 30 miles away, we'd be leveled. And unfortunately, just a couple of months later, on November 13th, 1985, the volcano would erupt, and it would create a massive mudslide that would just devastate Amero. The mudflow covered 85% of this town in heavy, thick sludge. It destroyed buildings and bridges, and it killed 25,000 people, Remember, there's only 31,000 people in this village to begin with, so 80% of the population has been killed by this mudslide. Because of how big of a disaster this was, it took a while for the rescue efforts to mobilize, and so anybody that was on the fringe of being saved unfortunately perished because no one was there to rescue them in time. And then when rescue crews did get out and did start helping people, there just wasn't enough. There weren't enough people to help. And so hundreds of people that could have been saved were just trapped and no one could get to them in time. Photojournalist Frank Fournier arrived in Colombia 2 days after this eruption with the intent to photograph the ground rescue that was going on inside of Amero. When he actually arrived in Amero, he was really shocked to see just how completely destroyed this town was and how totally ineffective the rescue efforts were. It was just totally chaotic. It wasn't really clear who was helping who. There were people literally dying all over the place. It just seemed crazy that this was not being handled better. Amid this chaos, a farmer approached Frank and told him he needed to come over and try to help this girl who was trapped under a house. So he brings Frank over to this house that's been completely submerged in water and mud, and clinging to a branch is this 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez that's been trapped up to her neck in water. She's pinned by something in the water. They didn't know what it was, but she's been there for 60 hours. When Frank arrived, he spoke to the other rescuers that were there trying to get her out. And they said that she's been in great spirits and she's been joking about how she doesn't want to be late for school. She's just been a really positive force and we really want to get her out, but it keeps raining, so the water keeps rising and she's already up to her neck and she's just trapped. We can't get her out. Shortly after Frank arrives, Omaira went from chipper and lively and kind of making light of everything to most likely realizing that she wasn't going to get out of the water. And so she began telling the rescue workers to let her be, to let her rest. And she propped herself over this branch and she just laid there, kind of allowing herself to pass away. Frank felt totally helpless. I mean, he's looking at this poor girl that's going to die unless they can get her out of the water, but no one seems to be able to do it. And it just seemed totally impossible that we can't just find a way to get her out. But it would turn out that her foot was pinned under a brick door and her aunt, who had passed away and was trapped under the rubble, had grabbed her ankle and had died that way. So it was like a death grip on her ankle. And so not knowing what to do, Frank just did what he knew how to do, which was take pictures. And he knelt down and he took this picture of Omaira. And very shortly after this picture was taken, she would pass away. This picture would win the 1986 World Press Photo of the Year. When it was published, it was so disturbing that this poor girl was not able to be rescued that it created an international backlash on Colombia's nearly non-existent rescue efforts. His classmates and his teachers recalled him being very shy, but at the same time having these strange mannerisms where all of a sudden he would burst out hysterically laughing, usually at something he had been muttering to himself in class. The school blamed Ed's mother for Ed's kind of odd behavior, because Ed would admit that his mother punished him if he showed signs of having friends. So Ed's childhood was incredibly lonely and isolated. Ed's mother would confine he, along with his brother Henry, to their farm. He was basically never allowed to leave with the exception of school, and when he was at the farm, his mother would regularly read from the Bible and would tell Ed and his brother Henry that basically everybody else in the world is evil. We are the only pure ones. Everyone is evil and you should stay away from them. In 1944, when Ed was 38 years old, he and his brother Henry were burning away some marsh vegetation on their property. And at some point, the fire got out of control and the fire department had to be called in. And after they put out the fire, Ed was okay, but they couldn't find Henry. He was just gone. That night, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh in that same area where the burn was going on. He had died of asphyxiation. At first, the fire was blamed, but then authorities discovered that Henry had actually died before the fire started. And so all eyes turned to Ed, who was the only one with him at the time, but there was no hard evidence connecting Ed to Henry, and Ed said, "I didn't do it." So Henry's death remained labeled an accident, even though basically everyone believed that Ed must have been the guy that strangled his brother to death before the fire was set. Shortly after his brother's death, Ed's mother also died, leaving Ed alone in this farmhouse. Ed began to make some modifications to the farmhouse, not to improve it or to make it bigger and better, but rather to board off all of the rooms in the house that his mother ever used. He basically made them time capsules. He didn't touch them, he just sealed them off. And so he confined himself to a single room in this farmhouse that he did not take care of. And so filth is just piling up everywhere. And so he just kind of lived in squalor in this one weird room. While living in seclusion, Ed became obsessed with cannibalism. He basically spent all his time reading about cannibalism inside of this tiny room in his boarded up farmhouse. And that's how he lived his life for the next 10 years. No one really ever saw him. Then in November of 1957, a local hardware store owner, her name was Bernice Worden, goes missing. When police show up at the store to have a look around, they find bloodstains all over the place, and they discover in the register that the last person to make a purchase inside of the store was Ed Gein. So they go to Ed Gein's house to interview him and see if he knows anything about Bernice Worden, and so they're bracing themselves for probably finding her body at Ed's house. But they were not prepared for what they actually found at his house. What they find would end up inspiring movies like Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Basically, inside of Ed's house was a whole bunch of human remains, but not in the way that you would imagine. Ed was taking human body parts and making things like kitchen utensils and bowls, and he was using skin to create seats and lampshades and bedposts. I mean, his whole house was like built of human bones and flesh. Bernice Worden's body was found as well, and she was kind of hung up as if she was next up to be made into some sort of kitchen utensil or chair or table. When questioned, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Worden, but as for the dozens of other bodies that were inside of the house, he claims they were from robbing graves, but no one really knew if that was true or not, and they weren't able to ever actually convict him for anything beyond the killing of Bernice Worden. As for his motive, he told investigators that what he really wanted to do, what he intended to do, was build what he called a woman suit that would resemble his mother, and it would allow him to, quote, crawl into his mother's skin. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to a mental hospital where he stayed until his death in 1984. Here is just a sampling of some of the things that Ed Gein made using human body parts. What is not pictured here are things like his lampshade, his seat, as well as his gloves and his belt. If you feel so inclined, you can Google those things. A man living in India named Maqsood Khan had become completely and totally obsessed with tigers. His wife and his family weren't entirely sure what caused him to be so fixated on tigers, but they noticed after a kind of random trip to the zoo that he took, that he came home and all he could talk about were tigers. So they figured he must have seen tigers at the zoo and just become totally enamored with them. But Maqsood's obsession with tigers was not just, love and affection for these animals, although certainly there was that. It was more of a dark fascination with tigers' savage nature. The story Maqsood used to tell all the time to his friends and family was about this tiger that was in captivity, and one day its two trainers had gone into the cage to put a garland of flowers around its neck for maybe some ceremony or something, and the tiger just wasn't having it that day, and when they went to put it on its neck, the tiger kind of snapped and killed the two trainers. Now, Maqsood was not telling the story to kind of glorify the violence of it, or even to act like it wasn't a big deal that these trainers had been killed. He was telling the story with a reverence for these creatures that were kind of untamable, that even in captivity, they were in control, and he was just totally fascinated by them. In May of that year, Maqsood lost his job, something that unfortunately happened all the time for him because he was known to be kind of lazy and kind of happy-go-lucky, didn't take things very seriously. He had actually been fired from a job one time when he was supposed to be unloading sacks from a truck and got distracted by some small animal and ran after it, and his employer fired him for it. But his family depended on him, and they said, Maqsood, you gotta go out and get another job. And so during the day, Maqsood would go out and tell his family, I'm going out job hunting, but what he was really doing is spending the little money his family had to go to the zoo to go look at these tigers that he was so in love with. So for the next 4 months, Maqsood would just lie to his family and would go to the zoo and stare at the tigers in their exhibit. And so one day when he was doing just that, on September 23rd, 2014, he was looking into the white tiger exhibit. Now, the way it was set up is there was an outer fence that all of the people who were at the zoo could stand right against. and it was an open air exhibit. Right on the other side of that fence, all the way around, was a little bit of land that protruded into the exhibit a little ways, and then it would drop straight down into a moat that was another layer of protection between the tigers and people, so they were not interacting. If you continued straight past the moat, it would go back up again to this little island right in the middle of this exhibit where all the tigers would spend all their time. For some reason that we don't fully understand, although one could guess that it was simply because Maqsood wanted a better look at the tigers, he climbed over that first fence, the one that no visitors are allowed to cross. And he walked to the edge of that piece of land that sits over that moat. And he's looking down at the tigers, and the guards are telling him to get back on the other side of the fence. All of the other people that are there watching the tigers as well, the other visitors, they're saying, hey, come back, don't do what you're doing. And at some point, Maqsood fell 15 feet into the tiger enclosure. Immediately, an alarm goes off, waking up the tigers in their habitat. So they don't know what's going on. They're kind of looking around. And the people that are watching this happen from the safety of behind this fence, they're screaming and yelling, and they're trying to get security to come over, and they're trying to save this guy. It's just chaos. But what's really happening is they're totally inciting the tigers to see what the heck's going on. And very quickly, one of the tigers notices that there is now a person, Maqsood, who's in the moat. And the tiger jumps down into the moat and walks right over to Maqsood. And Maqsood is sitting there and he's absolutely terrified. And people said that he was just praying, and he's huddled up against the side of the moat. And the tiger's just looking at him. The tiger's not showing signs that it's going to harm Maqsood. But the people that were watching this happen, that are on the other side of this fence, are either taking videos and pictures of the event, or some of them begin picking up rocks and throwing them at the tiger to try to, I guess, get the tiger to leave Maqsood alone. 10 minutes goes by of people throwing rocks at this tiger, and the tiger gets really upset. And so what do you think happens once the tiger gets upset? It attacks Maqsood. The tiger clamped down on Maqsood's neck and dragged him over to a grassy kind of hidden section within the enclosure. And by the time the staff finally showed up with a tranquilizer gun, it was too late for Maqsood. He was already dead. Here is the final picture of Maqsood after he's fallen inside of that moat. This is taken moments before this tiger would ultimately attack and kill him. The police would ultimately charge the zoo staff with death by negligence for their incredibly long response time and for not having a couple that loved traveling to Thailand. In fact, they went there so often and loved it so much that they considered it their second home. In 2004, instead of spending Christmas with their family back home in Canada, they decided, you know what, we're empty nesters, we're on our own, let's go spend Christmas in a place that we love that's also warm, Thailand. And so they settled on one of their favorite spots in Thailand called Khao Lak. It's this beautiful beach town. They'd been there many times, and so they were pumped. On Christmas Day, they called their family and said they're having such a great time. The weather is beautiful. They have this wonderful beach right in front of them. And by all accounts, their vacation seemed to be going really perfectly. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the couple woke up and decided to head down to the beach to spend the day lounging on the sand. But as soon as they stepped out of their villa and looked down at the beach, which was right outside of where they were staying, they saw this huge crowd of people standing on the sand. And even though it was early in the morning, John and Jackie knew immediately why they were down there. It was an extremely low tide. The water had receded so far that it was a spectacle. And so they had their digital camera with them and they just started taking pictures. What John and Jackie and the people down on the beach seem not to have realized is that that extreme low tide is actually an early indication of a tsunami tidal wave, where the water basically gets sucked way out in preparation for a massive wave. What John and Jackie and everybody down on that beach should have been doing that morning is turning around and running inland as far as they possibly can go and as high as they possibly can go. But they don't do that. In fact, it looks like no one has any idea what's about to happen. And so John and Jackie continue to take pictures, and you see this massive wave coming closer and closer with every picture they're taking until it wipes out everybody down on the beach and eventually wipes out John and Jackie. They would be swept away to their death along with 230,000 other people. John and Jackie's camera would be found on the beach a month later. The camera itself was destroyed, but the SIM card was intact. And the person who found it would take that SIM card, plug it into their computer, and here are the final pictures that were on that SIM card. spelunkers, which is a term given to people who explore underground caves. In November of 2009, 26-year-old John was back home in Utah celebrating Thanksgiving with his family. During his visit, someone in his family suggested they go cave exploring like old times as a way to kind of reconnect. And so John, along with his younger brother Josh, who was 23 at the time, and 9 other friends and family got together and headed off to Nutty Putty Cave, which was a very popular spelunking location in their area that no one in his family had actually explored. On November 24, 2009, around 8 p.m., John and his brother, along with the rest of their friends and family, entered Nutty Putty Cave, and they make their way to the section called the Big Slide. It was not particularly challenging, and John, even though he had not been cave exploring in a really long time, felt like he could do something more difficult. So he and his brother decided to split off from the main group and make their way over to the most challenging section of the cave, known as the birth canal. So John and Josh start making their way over towards that section of the cave. They have a map and they're kind of trying to follow as best as they can. And John, who was leading the pair, stops when he gets to this waist-high hole in the wall that he believes is the entrance to the birth canal. When John was growing up and he used to go cave exploring with his family, he was much smaller. He was a kid. Now he's a grown man. He's 6 foot, over 200 pounds, but he still had the mindset of when he was a kid. And so like a child, he sees this hole and literally goes headfirst into it without any second thoughts. So John begins painstakingly inching his way down this tunnel that's completely tight on his body. His arms are pinned under his body, and with every movement he's making, he's getting tighter and tighter. But he's convinced that this is the birth canal and that it just takes certain people that are brave enough to push past that discomfort, that claustrophobia, that if you just push past this tight section, you'll get to a place where it opens up. So John, believing this is the birth canal, kept going farther and farther into this tunnel until he's completely wedged. He has a little bit of tunnel still in front of him that actually kind of bends down in front of him. And he thinks, man, that's it. I just gotta go all the way down there and I can get into that opening. And so he's caught up against a lip of rock that's underneath his ribs. And so in order to get past it, he breathes all of the air out of his lungs and he pushes himself just past the lip. And then he breathes in again, and his chest expands, and his rib cage is literally caught up on that lip because he's now moved past it. He can't bring himself back over the lip. And what's worse is as soon as he got over that little lip, he got a better view into this hole he was going down, and it dead ends. It just gets to a point. There was nothing there. It was not the birth canal. It was an unmarked tunnel somewhere in this cave. So he's trapped, and he knows it. And to make matters even worse, John was almost completely upside down. John yells to his brother and says he's stuck. Josh starts going down this tunnel and he almost immediately gets stuck. And from where he is, he can barely see his brother, who's way down this tiny little tunnel. And he knows that if he's stuck up here, his brother's really stuck. This is a very, very bad situation they're in. So Josh barely gets himself out of this tunnel and he yells to John that he's gonna go get help. But it would take 3.5 hours for the first rescue worker to arrive on scene because they are way down into this cave. This is not an easy to access area. Susie Matola was the first rescue person, and when she arrived, she said, "Hey John, how you doing down there?" And Susie would say that John sounded very distant, and he just said, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really, really want to get out." Susie immediately reassured John that she will have him out in no time, everything's gonna be just fine. But when Susie looked down into this tiny little space that John was stuck in, she thought this is gonna take a really long time to get him out. I mean, just to set up a pulley system to try to pull him out is gonna take a long time. And then inching a 6 foot, 200 pound man out of this tiny space, that's gonna take hours and maybe even days. But unfortunately, John didn't have the time. The human body is designed to be upright, with gravity helping your heart pump blood to the rest of your body. When you're inverted, blood pools in your brain and your heart cannot work fast or hard enough to get it out in time, and so it eventually causes your body to shut down. So when the trauma physician saw that John was inverted and he had already been there for 3.5 hours before rescuers even got to him, he told Susie and the rest of the rescuers that John maybe has 8 to 10 hours left to live. The rescuers tried everything to try to get John out of the cave. They put a rope around his legs and tried yanking him out. Didn't work. They set up an elaborate pulley system. It barely worked, but they kept falling out of the wall, and so it was taking all this time just to get set up, only to move him a fraction of an inch. They got drills and chisels, and they went down into the tunnel and began trying to chisel John out. But again, it was almost negligible progress, and it was just taking too much time. As the rescuers are doing everything they can to try to get him out, they noticed that John's breathing was becoming labored and his voice sounded nasally, indicating that more and more fluid was building up now inside of his lungs, and that probably they were within the last few hours that he was going to be alive. At some point, they finally got John to move just a couple of inches using this really elaborate pulley system that they had found a way to stay anchored in the walls, but they saw there was a huge problem. No matter what system they were going to use to get John out of this hole, due to the angle of the cave he had crawled into, his legs would not fit. They would not bend in the right direction on the way out. They would have to break his legs in order to curve him around this bend in the cave. With John's breathing already labored and him being basically unresponsive at this point, they figured that if they broke his legs, that would just send him into shock and kill him anyways. And so they realized that they cannot get John out of this cave. He's going to die here. 27 hours after John had become stuck, he became unresponsive and he was declared dead. The 26-year-old medical student would leave behind his wife as well as their 1-year-old daughter, and his wife was due with their second child in June of the following year. Following John's death, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed off with cement, and John's body is still inside Nutty Putty Cave to this day. And here is a picture of John exploring Nutty Putty Cave before he ultimately made his way over to that fateful tunnel that he went in head first and ultimately died inside of. Taylor Gilliams and her good friend Brendan Vega, who was also 22, decided they wanted to go hiking. Now, they were both highly inexperienced hikers, so when they were looking in the area for places to go hiking, they were looking for novice trails, things that they would be able to manage. And they thought they had found one in Santa Barbara, California. And so they headed off in that direction and they took off on this particular trail. A little ways into their hike, and they started to feel like, man, the terrain here is pretty treacherous. This is way more difficult than we were expecting when we looked at the map. And as they continued and they're climbing over these huge boulders and it just seems totally like an advanced trail, they start to wonder, did we veer off the trail? Worried they might be lost, they turned around and began backtracking, hoping to find the trail and find some landmark that would allow them to confirm they were on the right trail. As they're backtracking, not only do they not find the trail, but they don't find any trail. They've managed to go completely off the path and are now in this kind of random boulder field that they have no idea where it is on the map. Navigating this terrain in the daytime with light would have been difficult, even for an experienced hiker. But now it's nighttime, they don't have flashlights, and they're jumping boulder to boulder, and Sailor at some point loses her footing and falls and fractures her leg. Brendan rushes over and tries to help Sailor stand up, but she can't move. And so Brendan tries to put her on his shoulders and starts walking with her. And that works for a little while until they're passing by this waterfall and they fall off of it and they come careening down, they smash onto the ground, they survive the fall, but Brendan now has a broken elbow and Sailor now has a broken ankle on top of her broken leg. Sailor's in excruciating pain, and because of this fall, there's just no way Brendan's going to be able to lift her back up and keep walking. And so the decision was made that Brendan was going to go try to find help on his own, and that she would stay here and continue to yell for help in hopes that someone might hear her before Brendan got back. He takes off, and as soon as he's around the corner and gone, Sailor begins screaming for help, and she would continue screaming for help all through the night, well into the next day. About 24 hours after Brendan had left, he still had not returned, and at this point, Sailor's in and out of consciousness. She knows that she's going downhill quickly unless someone finds her. By the following afternoon, Brendan is still not back yet. So laying face down in the mud with flies buzzing all over her head, she was helpless and trapped, and there was nothing she could do but wait until either a miracle occurred and someone found her, or most likely she just dies. So at the same time that Sailor and Brendan are going through this horrible ordeal, 3 totally unconnected people decide they want to blow off work and school and just go escape into nature. And so they settle on a hike that would bring them to a waterfall in Santa Barbara, California. Even though this waterfall was a popular tourist attraction, it was very difficult to get to it. It basically required 45 minutes of almost uphill climbing across boulder fields. Very dangerous, and it's not something for a novice hiker to be doing. So they reach the parking lot, they take off on this hike, and when they're just at the base of the waterfall, instead of taking the main trail up to the top, The three hikers decide, let's actually go around off the trail to this pocket of boulders over here where there's a couple freshwater pools that have formed underneath the base of the waterfall. So they leave the main trail and they're climbing over these huge boulders. It's very dangerous. And at some point, one of the hikers starts taking pictures as they're kind of going across these boulders. Through the viewfinder, as they're taking pictures, they notice something out of the corner of their eye that's in frame. It was like this red flash of something. And so the hiker puts their camera down and she looks down where she sees this red, and she can tell right away that it's someone's hair. It's a girl's dyed red hair. And it was Sailor. The hikers went down to Sailor and they called 911, and they came in, they airlifted her out of there, and Sailor would actually make a full recovery. Unfortunately, Sailor's friend Brendan did not make it. They found his body about 100 meters away from where she had been laying. After the ordeal, the woman who was taking those pictures and had spotted Sailor out of the corner of her eye, she went to her camera and was flicking through some of the pictures she had taken during the hike. She had inadvertently taken a picture of Sailor before they had found her. So had it not been for these hikers being where they were and taking those pictures and noticing her red hair, this picture almost certainly would have become the last picture of Sailor Gilliam's alive. A 4'10", 18-year-old girl from Alabama who, despite her tiny stature, had a huge personality and was incredibly popular. Everybody seemed to love this girl. In 2015, Jolie had just graduated high school and was planning to move away from her town and go to college outside of Alabama, and she was really excited about it. But she had a bit of a problem because she had this boyfriend named Lauren Brunner who she had repeatedly tried to end the relationship with because he was so possessive, but she hadn't been able to successfully break up with him yet. Every time she tried to, he would threaten that he was going to hurt himself or that he was going to hurt her if she ever left him, and so she never quite followed through. But with college on the horizon and to her what felt like this fresh start once she left Alabama, she finally pulled the plug on her relationship with Lauren and made it very clear that they are done. And she was firm on that decision even when Lauren did start lashing out and yelling at her and pleading with her and doing everything he could to win back her affection, but it just wasn't going to work because she had moved on. For weeks, Lauren was trying to convince Jolie to change her mind, but again, Jolie just stayed firm on her decision. And after quite some time, it seemed like Lauren had finally got the message because his messages and cries for her to change her mind had stopped, and there was finally a little bit of distance between the two of them. On August 29th, 2015, Lauren would break that silence and would reach out to Jolie and ask her if she wanted to go for a hike with him, simply as friends. Jolie was naturally hesitant about this, worrying that, this hike as friends could very quickly turn into something more that she didn't want, but she did want to remain friends with Lauren. He was very important to her, and so she reluctantly agrees to go on this hike. After Jolie responded to Lauren that she was willing to go, Lauren was really excited, and so he posted on Instagram this picture of himself looking, I guess, excited. It's hard to tell from the image, but the caption basically said that he was excited about going on this hike with her and that things were, quote, looking up. At the same time, after Jolie had given that answer to Lauren, after she had agreed, yes, I'll go hiking with you, she texted her friend jokingly, if something happens to me, you'll know who I was with. The next day, on August 30th, Lauren picks up Jolie and he begins documenting their trip on his Instagram page. Jolie gets in the car and he takes a picture of her and he captions it, on our way to go hiking. The second image that he uploads is of Jolie walking her dog Kiba in a parking lot. It appears that this lot is at the base of the hike they're about to go on. The third image shows Jolie standing on a rock overlooking this forest, and she's holding her dog Kiba. And it's clear, based on this picture, that now they've actually begun the ascent up this trail. The fourth and final picture that was uploaded to his Instagram page shows Jolie standing on a rocky cliff, and she's holding her own camera up and she's taking pictures out over this valley. And the picture was captioned, Jolie the photographer. Immediately after this picture was taken, Lauren would shoot Jolie twice and push her off of that cliff. He was sentenced to 52 years in jail and bragged to the inmates he was with that if he couldn't have her, No one. A wealthy doctor named Arthur Duperrault chartered a luxury yacht called the Bluebell to take he and his family from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to the Bahamas. Along with his family, which was Jean, his wife, his oldest son Brian, who was 14, Terry Jo, who was 11, and Renee, who was 7, Arthur also brought along Julian Harvey, who was a close friend of his that he had hired to be the captain of the ship. And Julian was going to bring along his wife, who was named Mary Dean. And so on November 8th, 1961, the Duperraults and the Harveys set sail on the Bluebell, and by all accounts, their trip was going extremely well. But on the 5th night of the cruise, Terry Jo was down in the sleeping quarters of the Bluebell when she woke up to the sound of stamping sounds and screaming coming from above. She was so scared about what could be going on up there that at first she didn't do anything. But eventually she summoned the courage, got out of her bunk, and she kind of slowly made her way up the stairs and poked her head out onto the deck. And immediately she sees that her family is lying on the ground. They're all deceased. As Terry Jo is frozen in terror, Julian Harvey comes running up to her and tells her to go back down into the sleeping quarters. And so, not knowing any better, she just turns around and runs back down to her bunk. But as she's sitting there, she sees that water is flooding into the Bluebell. She can't stay down here or she's going to drown. So Terry Jo goes back up the steps, she goes onto the main deck, and she sees Julian Harvey, who's standing over the edge of the boat. And she yells to him and says, "Are we sinking?" And he looks at her and he just says, "Yes." And then he promptly jumps over the railing and swims to the lifeboat that had detached from the Bluebell and was drifting away. He climbs onto it and takes off, abandoning her on the sinking ship. Unbeknownst to Terry Jo, was the reason the Bluebell was sinking in the first place was because of Julian Harvey. When he was hired to be the captain of the ship, he used this as an opportunity to bring his new wife out with him and then kill her and collect on her insurance policy. Because in her life insurance policy, there was a clause where he would get double the amount of money if she died in the case of a freak accident. But it's speculated that while he was attacking her, one of the Duperraults had seen him doing it, and so in order to cover his tracks, he had turned on the Duperrault family. And so while it's not entirely clear why he didn't just finish the job with Terry Jo, it seems like when he jumped over the railing and took off with the lifeboat, he must have assumed that Terry Jo was going to sink with the rest of the family, and then there would be no more evidence, no more witnesses. So 11-year-old Terry Jo, as she's standing on this sinking ship, she snaps into action. She remembers seeing a cork float that was pinned up against one of the walls of the ship, and she runs over and she undoes it, she puts it on the water, she climbs on top of it just as the Bluebell sinks under the surface of the water and disappears. And so now she's just stranded out in the middle of the ocean. She's got no food, no water, no shelter from the sun on this little dinky cork float. Over the next couple of days, as she drifted along aimlessly in the ocean, her cork float would begin to disintegrate, and she would have to start positioning her body on the float so there wasn't much weight on it because it was basically beginning to sink. And the only position she could find that worked was by dangling her feet in the water. So she's half on this cork float, half of her body is in the water. And so what began happening is parrotfish began swimming up and biting her toes, her feet, and her legs, but she couldn't do anything about it. She couldn't put her legs on the corkboard or it would sink. After 2 days of balancing precariously on this cork float, the parrotfish disappeared and a bunch of dolphins surrounded her. And later she would go on to say that this was the only part of this horrible ordeal where she felt some sort of comfort. These dolphins just swam around her and almost formed a protective barrier around her that kept the parrotfish away and kept other predators away from her. On November 16th, 1961, 84 hours after the Bluebell had sunk, a Greek freighter actually spotted Terry Jo. Amidst all the whitecaps, they were able to see this little girl on a float, and they drove over and there she was. And initially when they went down to try to get her, there was so many sharks swimming around her that they had to be very careful that they didn't accidentally knock her into the water where she might be eaten by sharks. But eventually they were able to get Terry Jo into their basket and pulled her up onto the ship, and she would make a full recovery. As for Julian Harvey, he had made it back to shore and had told authorities that the Bluebell had caught on fire and that everyone had drowned except for him. You know, he had done his best to save them, but he was the only one who could get out. And as luck would have it, he was literally in a police station giving information about what happened when the police were informed that Terry Jo had survived. And the police, they turned to Julian and they say, "Terry Jo survived. She's in the hospital. She's going to make a recovery." And Julian was said to have gone totally ashen in the face and then kind of composed himself and said, "Why, that's wonderful." Julian quickly excused himself and fled to a Miami hotel, and the next day he was found dead in his hotel room. This is the picture of Terry Jo that was taken by one of the Greek sailors right when they pulled up alongside her before they pulled her onto their ship. This image would soon appear in publications all over the world. Despite Terry Jo's horrifying ordeal, she would go on to live a very normal life and would have 6 children of her own. Union began investing heavily into nuclear power, and by 1977, the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station located in Chernobyl, Ukraine, was finally operational. The station itself was comprised of 4 reactors that were each labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. On April 25, 1986, a group of very sleep-deprived plant workers began running a series of routine tests on nuclear reactor number 4. They were trying to see if the reactor could still be cooled even in the event of a complete power loss. But during the test, perhaps because they were sleep-deprived and just didn't feel like doing it, they started cutting corners and violated a number of safety protocols that led to several surges of power inside of the reactor. This led to a chain reaction of explosions within reactor number 4 that culminated in a massive explosion that blew the lid off the building, exposing the reactor's core. It would take the Soviets 10 days to finally stop the fire that was raging inside of this exposed core, which meant for those 10 days, radiation on an unprecedented level was spewed into the environment by this fire. But even after the fire was controlled, you have all this radioactive material that needs to be properly disposed of. And so the Soviets started by using robots to go up and pick up these materials and dispose of them, but the robots were breaking down from the high levels of radiation. And so naturally the Soviets sent in groups of men to go pick up the material, and dozens of people died from radiation sickness. A few months after the explosion, the first steel sarcophagus was built around reactor number 4 to try to contain some of that radiation. But even with that protection, it's estimated that the area around Chernobyl will not be habitable for another 20,000 years. So as a result, the Soviet Union created what they call an exclusion zone, which is 19 miles all around Chernobyl that no one can go inside of. And so nature's kind of reclaimed this area that used to be a fairly bustling metropolis. 1 year after the disaster, Ukrainian containment crews finally broke into the steam corridor that was located underneath the molten remains of reactor number 4. And as soon as they stepped in, their radiation readers spiked all the way to the top. And so they know that whatever's at the other end of this L-shaped hallway is something they did not want to get close to. And so they put a camera on a chair with wheels, and they pushed it down the hall to where it finally broke that corner and had a clear line of sight to the other end. And using a timer on the camera, they were able to take a picture of one of the single most dangerous things in the entire world. It became known as the elephant's foot. It was a molten pile of nuclear fuel and melted metal and sand and concrete that had all kind of converged and seeped through a pipe meant for steam and found its way into the basement. It was and still is emitting the equivalent level of radiation of 4.5 million chest x-rays every hour. Today, if you were to stand in front of the elephant's foot without proper equipment for 30 seconds, your cells would start to hemorrhage and you would become viciously ill, and you could even die. At 2 minutes of exposure, you're definitely going to die. But not right away. You have 48 hours and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You are 100% going. 4 mechanics were performing routine maintenance on a wind turbine in the Netherlands. In the early afternoon, all 4 of them are standing on top of the turbine itself, 2 on one end and 2 on the other, and a small fire breaks out inside of the housing of the turbine, right near where you would go back into the housing. Now, it's unclear what caused the fire, but it's speculated that it was caused by a short circuit. The 2 engineers on this side of the turbine were able to jump over the fire, land in the stairwell, and run their way down to safety. The other 2 on this side had a bad angle and could not make the jump, and so they had to wait until rescue workers showed up to put the fire out. But wind turbines are usually in areas that are very far away from society because they're huge and they're kind of eyesores. And so the response time was not good. The fire department did not show up very quickly, and by the time they got to the wind turbine, that little fire had gotten much, much bigger and had creeped up onto the platform that they are on. And then when the fire department actually started performing their job, the fire had spread well down the stairwell, and so it was very difficult and took a very long time to make their way up using the stairs. And the crane on the truck itself did not extend high enough to reach them either. The two trapped mechanics are watching this in real time. They're looking down and they can see the fire department is not going to be able to reach us in time because the fire is now spreading and getting bigger and bigger, and they're being pushed to the very edge of this wind turbine with an 80-meter fall to the ground. As the fire inched closer and closer and closer to them, the men must have realized that they have to make a decision here. They can either sit here and wait and hope for some miracle that perhaps a helicopter shows up and scoops them up, or some other mechanism of rescue is able to occur, or they try to make a run for it through the flames on the top of the turbine into the stairwell and just hope that the fire in the stairwell is not as severe and that maybe they can run through it and make it out the other side. Or the final option is to jump off the side and hope you survive the fall. And so as the fire continued to grow and get closer and closer to them, the men embrace one last time, and then one of them makes a run for it through the flames into the stairwell. His charred body would be found right at the landing of the stairs. He did not make it very far. He really had no hope. The last remaining mechanic is standing there wondering what he should do. He's probably looking down in hopes that he's going to see his friend who just ran in there emerge at the bottom on the ground, safe. But he doesn't. And after a considerable amount of time and the fire is getting closer and closer, he knows his friend didn't make it, and probably not wanting to suffer the fate that his friend did, he jumps. This is the picture of the two mechanics embracing for that final time. I'm sure at the time of this picture, they were aware that almost certainly they were not going to get out of this alive. They were 19 and 21 years old. School student going to school in Danvers, Massachusetts. He lived at home with his single mother. Classmates described Chisholm as being quiet, a bit of a loner. He was a great student, and he was the leading scorer of his soccer team. On October 22nd, 2013, Chisholm missed soccer practice in the afternoon and then missed a team dinner that night, at which point his teammates tried calling and texting him. He didn't get back to them, so they got in touch with his mother. She tried reaching out to him to no avail, and so she contacted the police and said, "My son is missing." On the same night that Chisholm is reported missing, one of his teachers, 24-year-old Colleen Ritzer, doesn't come home from work. Her family and her friends try reaching out to her, texting her, calling her, no response, so they too go to the police and they report her missing as well. The police were already looking for Chisholm, so when they hear one of his teachers is also missing, they assume they must be linked, and so they go to the high school, even though it's well after hours, to see if maybe there's some clues there. They search the high school, and Chisholm is not there, and neither is Miss Ritzer, but when they're looking in the girls' restroom that was right next to Miss Ritzer's classroom, they find a small splash of blood. Even though at the time they had no way of knowing if this blood was connected to Chisholm or Miss Ritzer, they decided they would pull all the security footage for the past 24 hours that was looking in the direction of this bathroom. And they make a startling discovery starting at the 2:54 p.m. mark on October 22nd, the day they went missing. This is Miss Ritzer walking down the hall towards the bathroom that had blood in it. This is Chisholm following Miss Ritzer into the hall. He's looking hesitant. He doesn't really know what he's going to do. He's thinking about following her, and at some point he says, "You know what? I am going to do this." He goes back into the classroom, re-emerges with his hood on, and walks down the hall towards the bathroom where Miss Ritzer is. This is Chisholm entering the girls' bathroom with surgical gloves on. 11 minutes later, Chisholm would leave the bathroom. Miss Ritzer would still be inside. Chisholm would leave school property, he would run outside, he would get a big recycling bin, and then he would wheel that back into the school, and then he would go back into the bathroom with the recycling bin. At 3:21 p.m., 26 minutes after Chisholm had first entered the girls' bathroom after Miss Ritzer, he re-emerges, now wearing a full face mask. He doesn't have a sweatshirt on anymore, and he's pulling along this recycling bin that looks noticeably heavier than when he brought it in. And that's because Miss Ritzer's body is now stuffed inside of it. Police were able to locate Miss Ritzer's body using the surveillance cameras on the outside of the school. They just watched what he did with the recycling bin, and he didn't bring it very far away from the school. Police were able to quickly track Chisholm down and arrest him because as soon as he was done attacking Miss Ritzer, he used her credit card to go to a movie theater in town and watched a movie. So he's on security cameras watching the movie, and the police were tracking her credit cards because they noticed they were stolen and they saw that he had swiped the card at this movie theater. So he gets arrested and he's given a life sentence. Here is the footage of Chisholm leaving the girls' bathroom with Miss Ritzer's body inside of that recycling bin. His motives remain unclear, but he claims she used what he called a trigger word that really upset him. 6 p.m. on December 27th, 2015, a woman named Sarah Robinson was getting ready inside of her cabin on the 7th floor of a massive cruise ship. She and her boyfriend were going to dinner that night with Sarah's parents in one of the restaurants on board the ship. And in fact, this entire trip, this whole vacation, was actually a big gift from Sarah's parents to Sarah and her boyfriend. And so far, the trip had been totally amazing. I mean, all four of them, Sarah, her boyfriend, and Sarah's parents, had got to go swimming and drink great drinks and have great food, and it was just like a total dream. But now they only had one night left, tonight, and they wanted to make the most of it. And their plan was to go to the big buffet that the ship offered and just totally indulge on the amazing food and just have some laughs, share stories, and then the next day they'd wake up in the Florida port that they left from, and the trip would be over. But for now, they had this one dinner left. And so after Sarah and her boyfriend were all ready, they left their cabin and they met Sarah's parents out in the hallway, and then Sarah led the way towards the stairwell that would bring them up to the 10th floor where the restaurant was that they were going to. Once they reached the 10th floor, Sarah could see right in front of her the entrance to this restaurant. And so she, her boyfriend, and her parents, all behind her, began walking towards the restaurant. And to get there, they would have to walk past this sort of lobby right in front of the restaurant, where there was this elevator bank that would go down to the lobby and all the other floors. And so, Sarah and her family, they walked past these elevators, and as they did, Sarah began to hear what sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. But that didn't make any sense because that whole day the weather had been beautiful and clear, and Sarah, when she heard this sound, she instinctively kind of looked around the corner out one of the windows and she looked out into the night and it was still clear and beautiful out. So this could not be rain. And so Sarah, she turned around and she looked at her boyfriend and her parents with a sort of quizzical look, being like, "Do you hear this? Like, what is that sound?" And they clearly had heard it too and were looking back at her like, "I don't know." But before they could even start to discuss whatever this was, a woman who they didn't know, who was standing near these elevators as well, began to scream. It would turn out just a few minutes before this woman began to scream, the cruise ship's chief electrician, 66-year-old Jose Sandoval Opazo, had begun doing routine maintenance on the elevators that were located a few floors below the 10th floor, but still within that same elevator bank that could bring you up to the 10th floor where that restaurant was. And while Jose was performing this very routine and quick maintenance on the elevator, something strange happened. But to understand why this happened, you need to understand a little bit about Jose and the other electricians on board this cruise ship. So there was oftentimes a lot of very quick and easy maintenance that would need to get done on these elevators, which would involve going into the elevator shaft to do it. But again, these are very short bursts, in and out, very easy to do. All the electricians know how to do it. And the procedure was to actually fully shut down that elevator, like completely, and then go inside and do the maintenance, and then go through the process of starting the elevator all over again. But that was so disruptive to the flow of traffic on the ship each day, and it was just kind of a hassle. And so Jose and the other electricians had come up with this sort of workaround that didn't require them to shut down the elevator, because again, that was just a huge pain and they didn't want to do it. And so what they would do is they would wait until the elevator car within the shaft they needed to do maintenance on was at some other level, like on floor 2, and they would go into the elevator on like floor 8 and then quickly do the maintenance on the inside of the shaft or whatever it is they had to do. Or sometimes they would actually have to do repairs on the elevator car itself, in which case they would just kind of go in real quick, do the repairs, get out again. But all of it was predicated on just kind of knowing where the elevator car was in the shaft and being really quick, in and out. And so Jose and the other electricians had done this many times and there was no issues. But on this day, Jose, he got into the elevator shaft to make these simple repairs. And so he actually was standing inside of the shaft on top of the elevator car that was down, a few levels down from 10. And he began making these repairs. And suddenly the car lurched into action because a guest unknowingly had walked into the elevator car and pressed floor 10. And so Jose is on this elevator car that starts moving, and before he can even figure out what's going on, the little opening that he used, the kind of service entrance into the shaft, had been covered up by the elevator car. And so his exit was now gone, and he was now relatively slowly moving up the shaft. Now, Jose would have no idea when this car was going to stop, but if it went to the top, he'd get crushed, and he knew it. And so in kind of a moment of panic, Jose attempted to step to the side to somehow go between the wall and the elevator. It was like he had nowhere to go and he knew it, and he just took that path. But there was an inch of space between the wall and the car. And so the second he did that, the car kept going and it sucked him down into that space and just destroyed him. And so by the time this elevator car reached its destination, the 10th floor, and that guest got off the elevator car, by this point, Jose's body had been totally destroyed, and all of his blood was dripping down the elevator shaft, splattering into the walls and hitting the ground, and it sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. And so that's what Sarah and her family were hearing. And then the reason that woman started screaming is she was the first one who turned and saw all this blood coming down the front of the elevator doors. Medics would arrive quickly on the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Jose was deceased. 4th, 2017, a 17-year-old college student named Sanjay climbed up onto this boulder that was right off to the side of this hiking trail that he was on. Sanjay was on a day trip with about 20 of his friends from college, and they were in this part of southern India that was really famous for its long, winding trails and all these boulders that kind of sat off to the side of the trails. And then at the end of these trails that are in this part of India is this beautiful ancient Hindu temple that a lot of people will go and take pictures in front of and go inside of. And so that was where Sanjay and his friends were ultimately headed, was this temple. And from the boulder that Sanjay had just climbed up on, he looked up the trail, and from his view now, which was now slightly higher, he could actually see just barely the top of this temple. And so he was really excited about going to see it, and he couldn't believe how close they were. But as he was standing on this boulder, staring at the top of the temple, he also realized that kind of off to the side of the temple, basically right next to it, was this beautiful pool of water with a big wall around it and cement steps leading into it. I mean, it kind of looked like a swimming pool. And so because Sanjay and his friends had been hiking all day to this point, and it was really hot out, Sanjay really liked the idea of going swimming. And so he actually jumped off the boulder and just started running towards the temple and this pool. And he was yelling to his friends as he did, hey, I'm gonna go swimming. And so he ran, not to the temple, but to this random pool of water that was next to it. And he got to the steps and he immediately took off his shirt and he pulled his phone out of his pocket and he put it on the steps. And then he walked his way into the water and turned around, hoping to see his friends coming after him. And sure enough, all of his friends were smiling and laughing and running after him, ripping their shirts off, putting their phones down and jumping in too. And so pretty soon, this very quiet, peaceful pool next to this temple was packed full of very rowdy and crazy college kids. Now, to be clear, this pool of water was not intended to be a swimming area. It was dug about 300 years earlier for this temple, and many people began to view this pool of water as sacred because they believed it could cure diseases. And so what Sanjay and his friends were doing was totally taboo and not allowed. But I can promise you, Sanjay and his friends did not care. They were having a great time. And in fact, Sanjay was having such a great time that when he turned around and looked back up the steps they'd all charged in on, he saw one of his friends, whose name was Vishwas, was standing up out of the water reading what looked like a plaque about this pool of water. And Sanjay hated the idea of one of their buddies not getting to experience this fun. And so Sanjay, a little out of pocket, yelled out to Vishwas, hey, stop reading that and get in the water. Let's go. What are you doing? And Vishwas was obviously kind of embarrassed to be called out so publicly in front of the 19 other kids that were there. They're all looking up at him expectantly now, yeah, get in here, man. And Vishwas, he's like, okay, fine. And so he took off his shirt, put his phone down as well, and he got in the water with all of them. And very shortly after he did that, Sanjay kind of forgot about him and decided, hey, this would be a great time to take a photo of everybody here, memorialize this amazing trip. And so Sanjay, he waded over to the steps, he grabbed his phone, he came back towards the group, and he's looking at this big rowdy crowd of his friends who were totally not paying attention to him. And he's saying, hey guys, come over here. I want to take your photo, gather up, I'll take a photo of all of us. And so it took a couple of minutes, but eventually, all these kids got in frame, and Sanjay, he held the phone out, made sure everybody was there, and they all smiled, and he took a picture. And then after he took the picture, Sanjay put his phone back on the steps and returned to just splashing and goofing around with his friends. About an hour later, Sanjay and his friends had left the pool and were now in the temple and were just walking around exploring. But eventually, Sanjay just got tired of looking inside the temple. It was not very interesting to him. And so he eventually just went outside again and sat down on this low wall that was right outside the temple. And because he knew his friends would not be done for at least, 15 or 20 minutes or so, he just pulled out his phone and began kind of scrolling through social media and, doing what we all do on our phones. But eventually, Sanjay opened up his photo album to look at all the photos he had taken during the hike in, and then also that picture in the pool, and then also some pictures he took inside of the temple. And so he pulls up his pictures and just kind of starts scrolling through them, and he eventually reaches the photo that he took, selfie style, in the pool with all of his friends together. And so he opens that picture up and he looks at it and he smiles because it definitely was the best picture he took. He got all his buddies in frame. Everybody seemed so happy. But as Sanjay was looking at this photo, he realized there was something odd about it. There was just something in this photo that just seemed like it shouldn't be. And as he looked more closely at it, the smile on his face faded and he began to panic just a little bit. He didn't know if what he was looking at was real or not, but he knew he had to go find out. And so Sanjay put his phone away and he looked up and began looking around outside the temple at all the other people who had left, and many of them included his friends. And they were walking around, talking in groups or whatever. And Sanjay, he began looking at all of his friends and he would stare at their faces. He was looking for something, but he didn't see what he was looking for. And so after scanning the entire outside and not feeling satisfied, Sanjay got up and speed walked back into the temple and began going into each and every room, looking at every single person he encountered. And when he would find one of his friends, he would stare at their face. And when he didn't find what he was looking for, he just kept on going to every single room until finally he reached the last room of the temple and he found the last of his friends and he looked at their faces and still he did not see what he was looking for. And so now Sanjay is truly panicked. He's actually horrified at this point. He runs back outside and he finds their college professor who had come along to sort of chaperone the trip. And he ran up to this professor and he pulled out his phone. He opened up that photo of them in the pool and he showed the professor what he had found. And Sanjay pointed out the strange thing about this photo. And so the professor, he began looking at the photo too. And right away, he also could see this very strange thing that seemed very out of place. And so the professor asked Sanjay a few follow-up questions, about like what Sanjay had done since discovering this. And after Sanjay said, I've been all over the temple, I still can't figure it out. And so the professor knew the police would have to get involved. And so the professor got in touch with police. And so the police came out to the temple not long after that. And the students, so Sanjay and all of his friends, had been instructed to stay right by the temple. Do not go down to the pool, stay up here, let the police handle it. And so when the police came in, they came running by the group, and Sanjay and his friends were just kind of watching anxiously, waiting to see what happens. And then as the officers went down to the pool, from where Sanjay and his friends were standing, they actually did not have a clear view. The temple itself blocked their view, so they could not see the pool, but they could hear what the officers were doing. And at first, as Sanjay and his friends are standing there really nervously, they don't hear anything down at the pool. But then they hear one of the officers shout something out, like he's found something. And then Sanjay and his friends heard all this splashing as clearly officers were jumping into the pool. And it was at this moment when Sanjay heard that splashing that he knew the thing he saw in this photo, it had to be real. As horrible as that was, it had to be real. The reason why Sanjay's friend Vishwas was not in the water with everybody else, why he was up reading that plaque about the history of this pool, was because Vishwas did not know how to swim, but he didn't tell anyone. Nobody knew this. And so he was probably kind of embarrassed about it. And so maybe he was reading this plaque as sort of a way to, act distracted, like the plaque is the reason he's not swimming. But then when Sanjay, who meant no harm by this, but he yelled out to Vishwas, "Hey, come on, dude, get in here. Come swimming with us." Because he did it so publicly in front of all the other friends, it seems like Vishwas felt very pressured into getting into the water. And that's what he did. Instead of telling anybody that he could not swim, he just kind of shrugged, took off his shirt, pulled his phone out of his pocket, put it on the ground, and waded into the water. And as soon as he did, the entire group just kind of went back to goofing around and splashing and being totally chaotic. And then when Sanjay was like, "Hey, let's take that photo," he really did manage to get all of his friends in frame somehow, except one of them was Vishwas, and you can only see the top of his head. It's because he was drowning in the background of that photo, just nobody knew it. And so obviously an hour later, when Sanjay's looking at this photo, he sees the top of Vishwas's head and he's like, wait a minute, is he goofing around or is he drowning? And then he ran all around the temple looking for Vishwas. He wanted to prove that he was not in the pool still, that he was up here. But then after searching the entire area and not finding Vishwas, he went to his professor, they called the police, and the discovery was made. And unfortunately, by the time police pulled Vishwas out of the water, he was already deceased. Morning of June 27th, 1957, a 25-year-old Austrian mountain climber named Kurt Diemberger plunged his ice axe into the deep snow ahead of him and then used the axe to pull himself up and over a big ice clump. Kurt was totally physically and mentally exhausted by this point and only wanted to stop for like 2 seconds just to catch his breath. But he knew that was just not an option. Kurt and his climbing partner, a 32-year-old man named Herman Buell, were climbing one of the tallest mountains in the world, called Chogolisa, which is located in northern Pakistan. And they were doing this climb all alone. It was just those two, and they had virtually no safety equipment. Now, for reference, this was not normal. Anybody who climbed Chogolisa did so with Sherpas and guides and oxygen masks. I mean, this was a dangerous climb, and so serious measures had to be taken to ensure it was safe. But Kurt and Herman felt like, that takes all the fun out of mountain climbing. There has to be, like real risk here for this to be worth doing. And also, critically, Kurt and Herman were well aware of the fact that if they successfully climbed Chogolisa with no safety equipment, so what they were planning to do, that would be a new world record because nobody had ever done that before on this mountain. And so that felt like a really cool reason to go for this. And when they began their journey a few days earlier, when they began the climb, it had still felt like a great idea because the weather forecast was perfect for the rest of the time they expected to be on the mountain. However, earlier that morning, Kurt had turned around to talk to Herman, and he noticed off to the south was a kind of ominous dark cloud making its way toward them. Now, obviously, when you're on the ground and you look up and you see a dark cloud, you think, okay, it might storm, or it's actively storming. Maybe it's rain, maybe it's snow, but it's probably not a big deal unless it's like a tsunami or a hurricane or something, but dark clouds are just not really a big deal. But when you are 4 miles up one of the most treacherous mountains in the world, you got no other people with you, you got no safety equipment, and you see a dark cloud coming your way, yeah, that's terrifying. Because storms have been killing mountain climbers basically for as long as mountain climbing has been a thing. And so when Kurt and Herman saw this cloud, even though the weather forecast had been good, they knew that there was a real chance a storm was going to hit them before they reached the summit. And so they had to make a choice. Abort the mission now, go back to camp, and potentially give up on this climb altogether, thereby not getting the world record. Or they could risk it and just try to speed their way up to the summit before the storm arrived. And because Kurt and Herman were actually within about 1,000 feet to the summit when Kurt noticed this dark cloud, they decided, you know what, let's just risk it. We can get up there to the summit, get this thing done before this cloud ever gets to us. And so that was the decision they made. And it was also why Kurt and Herman knew there was no way they could slow down even for a second, because basically this was a sprint to the top. And if they slowed down, they might die. And so, panting and exhausted with the wind whipping up like mad, Kurt and Herman just kept moving up that mountain as fast as they possibly could. But when they got about maybe 500 feet away from the summit, so they're really close at this point, something changed. As Kurt was about to bring his axe back down into the snow to, pull himself up one more step, he suddenly realized he couldn't see the mountain in front of him. Like there was nothing. It was just pure white all around him. He couldn't even see the sky. It was like he was just in this void all of a sudden. And the reason for this is because that dark cloud had caught up to them. They were literally inside of the cloud. That's why they couldn't see anything. And so from behind Kurt, even though he can't see anything, he could hear Herman desperately screaming up to him, "Hey, we gotta turn around right now!" And Kurt obviously knew, yeah, it's too late. We are not gonna make the summit. We gotta go.
Kurt knew Herman was right. I mean, this is an absolute crisis. You know, if the storm that's basically brewing all around them didn't kill them, certainly the result of the storm would. I mean, all the snow that's going to land is going to fill in their tracks, and it would be nearly impossible to find your way back down again. And so this was like, we totally miscalculated, turn around and get out of here as fast as possible. And so that's what Kurt and Herman began to do. As fast as they could, they began going down the mountain, following along their tracks they had left on the way up. And pretty quickly, Kurt and Herman began making serious progress. And so Kurt was starting to feel optimistic that, you know, maybe they had managed to escape this just in time. But right at that moment, the ground underneath Kurt began to vibrate. Then Kurt looked down, and even though his visibility was basically nothing, he could tell from his legs that the ground was basically shifting underneath him. And then suddenly Kurt felt this feeling that you get when you're on like a carnival ride and you're dropped, that feeling in your stomach that you're falling. He got that because the ground underneath him just gave way. It was an avalanche. And so in absolute desperation, Kurt, who knows he's about to be sucked into an avalanche, he just jumped, like as far away from the mountain as he possibly could, kind of at an angle to the right, like he was leaping up and out of the avalanche and over to the right. But you got to remember, he's on this really steep slope. This is not like jumping on flat ground where you jump up and just return to where you jumped from. He's on a slope. So when he jumped out and to the right, it was like he was jumping off a building. He fell something like 30 or so feet before he hit the ground again. But when Kurt hit the ground, he kind of expected to be gobbled up by the snow and keep being sucked down the mountain, but he wasn't. He hit the ground and didn't move. And then he kind of sat up and he looked around and he realized he had successfully jumped out of the avalanche. He had done it. He saved himself. And so he began looking around. You know, the visibility is still terrible, but it's a little bit better because now the avalanche has basically gone down the mountain. You know, the storm is kind of passing, and so the visibility is decent. And, you know, Kurt, he's looking around, screaming out for Herman. He doesn't see him. And then it's like suddenly the visibility just opened up, and Kurt was able to look to his left where the avalanche had gone. And as he was looking, he saw what looked impossible. Basically, the land where they had been walking down this mountain was gone. It was like the avalanche had removed that part of the mountain. And so Kurt is basically laying in the snow on the edge of a new cliff where the avalanche had basically broken away the mountain. And so he's looking into this crevasse where the avalanche went and thinking, I can't believe how lucky I am, but I gotta go find Herman. And so Kurt stands up, and he's pretty battered from this 30-foot fall, but he's got adrenaline pumping through him, so he feels pretty good. And he scrambles his way 30 feet back up the mountain to this ridgeline where he originally jumped out of the avalanche, you know, hoping when he got up there that he might find some sign of where Herman went to, because they were pretty close together when the avalanche started. But when he got up there was no sign of Herman, and, you know, he turned around and looked back down the mountain, and he couldn't see Herman anywhere. But when he turned back around, looking now back up the mountain, so in the direction of where they had originally intended to hike, and then where they had to come back down from when they were in the cloud, he noticed that he could see very easily their tracks, he and Herman's tracks. And so with his eyes, he just kind of tracked these tracks all the way down the mountain to where he was. And as he did this, he noticed something. At first, it was like his brain couldn't compute what he was seeing. But after a moment, he knew. Here is a photo of what Kurt would have seen. However, keep in mind, this was not a photo Kurt took, and it's also from a slightly farther away perspective. But conceptually, this really is what Kurt saw that told him what happened to Herman. So in this photo, you can see the mountain and the summits at the top, and there's a trail that goes straight down and then appears to diverge, where there's tracks that go to the left from our perspective, the viewer's perspective. They go to the left around that cliff line, and the other set of footprints that disappear off the cliff. Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, the footprints that go to the left are Kurt's footprints. He just magically jumped and landed on the absolute edge of where this avalanche was going to happen, and Herman is the other set of prints. And so when that avalanche started, there was nowhere for Herman to go, and he was sucked into that avalanche and dragged over 1,000 feet down the mountain, and his body was never recovered.
Evening of December 29, 1986, a California Highway Patrol officer named Craig Pyre drove his cruiser down Interstate 15 in San Diego, California. With him was an NBC News reporter in the back seat, and there was a cameraman in the passenger seat. They were filming a segment about highway travel safety that was set to air on the evening news later that night. Officer Pyre was following his typical patrol route, but after a few minutes, they passed by a sign that said Mercy Road. It was an exit. And at that point, Officer Pyre turned to the news team, pointed at Mercy Road, and said, "That's where they found the body." So a little more than 36 hours earlier, at around 4 a.m. the previous morning, a 20-year-old college student named Kara Knott had been found strangled to death in a creek right near the Mercy Road exit. Kara had been on her way home from her boyfriend's house when, for whatever reason, maybe car troubles or maybe she was trying to help someone, but she wound up in that cul-de-sac, and then while she was there, she clearly encountered someone dangerous who took her life. And so this was actually why the California Highway Patrol and NBC News were collaborating on this news segment, because Kara's killer was still not caught. And so the idea behind this segment was basically to tell drivers along this highway, like, how to stay safe while they were out there, especially if for whatever reason they had to stop somewhere along the highway, like what to do in that situation. And so as Officer Pyre passed by the Mercy Road exit and continued down Interstate 15, he turned to the news crew, and as they filmed, he began talking about the basics of highway travel safety. Specifically, he said, look, one of the most hazardous things that can happen to you beyond an accident on the highway is if you have some sort of car trouble that forces you to stop on the highway. Because once you stop, there's an inclination for a lot of people to want to leave their vehicle. But that's a very dangerous thing to do.
Anything could happen. Being a female, you could be raped, robbed if you're a male, all the way to where you could be killed.
Officer Pyre also warned people not to get into a stranger's car, because there was a running theory at this point that perhaps Kara had gotten into her killer's car. As this particular segment was filmed, the one you just watched, Officer Pyre was looking ahead, and he noticed there was a car pulled over on the shoulder of the highway with its hazards on. So he turned to the news crew and basically said, look, here's a chance for us to actually show the people in real time what to do in case your car breaks down on the highway. So he pulled his cruiser over right behind the stalled car, he got out, and then gestured for the news crew to come with him. Officer Pyre walked over to the passenger side door of this car, and through the open window, he asked the driver to get out and talk to him. The driver did, and as the camera rolled, Officer Pyre asked him to explain, what's going on here, what happened to your car. The driver said he had run out of gas and then gotten stranded on the side of the road. And then he had left his car and walked to a gas station to get a gas can, came all the way back, he put the gas into his car, but his car still wouldn't start. Now, at this point, Officer Pyre is realizing that this driver is doing basically exactly what he shouldn't be doing, according to the safety tips Officer Pyre had given. And so on camera, he basically says to this guy, do you understand how dangerous it is to have left your car like that and walked alone on this highway? Do you understand what a hazard that is? And the driver just kind of looked at him and shrugged like, yeah, I guess so. After that, Officer Pyre called the man a tow truck. His car was towed and the man was on his way. And Officer Pyre got back into the cruiser with the news crew and they carried on. After that, Officer Pyre and the news crew wrapped up filming. And then after he dropped them back off again, they told him what time to expect his segment to air on NBC that night. And sure enough, that evening, Officer Pyre was in front of a TV as the broadcast started. And when Officer Pyre's actual segment aired on TV, to him and to the California Highway Patrol, it went great. It was 1.5 minutes long. It sort of hit all the high points. It showed Officer Pyre, talking about how to be safe on the highway and talking to the stranded motorist. It kind of did exactly what they expected it to do. And when it was over, Officer Pyre clicked off the TV and didn't think much about it, because it was not a big deal. It was just a basic safety video. And for the vast majority of other people who watched this clip live on TV, it really didn't stand out to them. Again, it was just kind of a routine police safety video. But there were a few people, when they watched this clip, that noticed something very specific. And within an hour of this clip airing on TV, those few people were calling the police in droves to tell them, we know what happened to Kara Knott. And the police would follow up on these tips. And sure enough, just over 2 weeks later, they had gathered enough evidence that they were able to arrest Kara Knott's killer. It would turn out all the clues the police needed to solve the Kara Knott murder case were right there in that 1.5 minute long video.
Because what happened to Kara had almost happened to over 24 other women in San Diego. And those young women were the ones who saw the news segment when it happened live, and they noticed this particular detail that clearly telegraphed who Kara's killer was. They were the ones who called police. On the night of Kara's murder, December 27, 1986, she pulled off Interstate 15 on the Mercy Road exit, and she came to a stop in that cul-de-sac. Now, we don't know exactly why she came to a stop in there, but either way, she was there, and that's where she encountered her killer. Now, the other 24 women who encountered the same person, the killer, they were terrorized and kind of tortured and held hostage for a couple of hours, but eventually were let go. But Kara wasn't. During her encounter, at some point, the killer clubbed her over the head and then strangled her to death with a rope. Now, the killer, at first, had gotten away with this, until they were featured on that 1.5-minute long video. And some of those women who had survived their attack, they're watching the segment, and suddenly their attacker is on TV. Now, they had previously reported their attack to police, but to this point, nothing had been done. And now they're staring at, for sure, the person who attacked them, who's right on TV. And critically, as part of this segment, they're hearing about how this other young woman had been attacked and killed on this highway. And they're thinking, oh, this person did that to me. I barely got away. I bet they killed this girl. And on top of that, as they're watching the news, staring at their attacker, they can see there's a fresh cut over their eye. And so put that all together and they thought, boom, that's the person who killed Karen Otts. And sure enough, the police would follow up on these tips and they would confirm that the man in the video with the cut over his eyebrow was Kara's killer. And Kara's killer was none other than Officer Craig Pyre. Officer Pyre was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Since being incarcerated, he has gone up for parole 2 separate times and been rejected both times. However, he is up for parole again in 2027. 1 p.m. on November 28, 1979, a 52-year-old tour guide named Peter Mulgrew stood at the front of the cabin of Air New Zealand flight TE901. Out the window next to him, he looked out and he saw this vast white landscape reflecting the afternoon sun. And so he grabbed the microphone and announced to the 237 passengers that they were now flying over Antarctica. The passengers got really excited and immediately pulled out their cameras and began snapping photos left and right. And as you can see from some of the photos that they took, a lot of the passengers actually got up out of their seats and moved around to get the best angle of the ground down below. Now, on a normal commercial flight, that behavior would not be okay. You can't just, wander all around the cabin. You need to basically stay seated. But this was not a normal commercial flight. This was a sightseeing flight. Air New Zealand regularly took off from New Zealand and would fly people up over Antarctica, and their tour guide would point out a few landmarks down below, and then that flight would land back in New Zealand. That was the whole thing. It was just a chance to go out and see Antarctica and take photos. Peter had been a tour guide for this flight many times before, and so he knew what to expect. He not only knew kind of how passengers react, but he also knew exactly when to look out which side of the plane to get the best view. And so after a couple of minutes, he called out to the passengers, hey, if you look out the left side of the plane, you'll get a great view of the coast of Antarctica. And so all the passengers, they immediately get up and shift over to the left side of the plane and they press their cameras up against the glass, they're taking photos. And then a couple of minutes later, Peter called out to the group again and said, okay, now look out the right side where you'll see Mount Erebus, this huge, stunning mountain. Now, Peter was accustomed to people gasping when they saw this mountain because it was so beautiful, so enormous. And as people piled up against the right side and began taking photos, that's what he heard. People were gasping. But then at the same time, the plane suddenly jolted hard, and one of those passengers on the right side took this photo. As you can see, there are black marks on the window, and these black marks are believed to be either engine oil or soot from Mount Erebus. Because Mount Erebus was not just some mountain. Mount Erebus was an active volcano, and the flight path of TE901 was supposed to have them going safely around Mount Erebus to get a nice full view of the volcano. But mistakes were made, and before the pilots could correct them, the plane flew directly into the volcano. And so this photo you're looking at almost certainly was taken literally at the moment of impact. A crash that resulted in 237 lives lost. The crash of flight TE901 was the worst aviation disaster in New Zealand history, and as a result,
Air New Zealand no longer offers those sightseeing flights. 8:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, a 13-year-old girl named Barbara Kent was sleeping inside of a cabin in Ruidoso, New Mexico, where she was staying for a sleepover summer dance camp. And as she slept, suddenly there was this loud booming sound that literally shook her awake and actually caused her to fall out of her bed onto the floor. Barbara sat up feeling totally confused, and she looked around the cabin and she saw the 9 other girls that were also here for the sleepover camp. They too were wide awake, and some of them also had fallen onto the floor. And so the girls, they're all freaking out. They're looking at each other like, what's going on here? What was that? And as this kind of pandemonium is ensuing, their lead dance instructor came running into the cabin and told the girls that she thought one of the cabin's heaters had exploded and that potentially there could be a fire somewhere on the camp. And so all the girls, they're already totally panicked. Now they're getting really scared. And the instructor's just like, all right, girls, go outside, stand by the river. I'm gonna go find wherever this explosion happened and make sure everything is okay. And so the girls, they were led outside, totally a mess, and they went and stood by this river near the cabin and waited for their instructor to go look around. And so Barbara and the 9 other girls, they're totally terrified, and they're standing by this riverbank, and they're kind of looking around the property, seeing if they can see smoke or fire, but they can't. And as they're standing there waiting for their instructor to come back, Barbara felt something hit the tip of her nose, and it was cold and soft. And she looked up and she realized it was snowing. But it's July in New Mexico. It should not be snowing. But sure enough, snow was coming down from the sky. And as the snow came down on Barbara, she looked at the other girls, and they too were looking up and putting their hands up and letting the snow hit them in the face. They couldn't believe it. I mean, this was like a totally rare weather event. And so a minute later, their dance instructor came back and told the girls that, she looked all over the camp and there did not appear to be a fire or an explosion of any kind, that everything seemed fine. They didn't know what that loud sound was, but by all accounts, it seemed safe here. And so the girls were very relieved to hear this, but already their attention had completely shifted to the snow. I mean, again, it's July in New Mexico. There shouldn't be snow. And so the girls, they turned to their instructor and they're like, okay, well, now that it's safe, would it be okay if we put on our bathing suits and just went swimming in the river while it snowed on us? I mean, this is incredible. And the instructor, who to this point had really been focused on finding the fire and the hazard or whatever, now that she knew things were safe, she kind of took in the scene and also suddenly appreciated how unbelievable it was that there was snow coming down. And so she told the girls, yeah, get your bathing suits, go swimming, enjoy this. This is totally like a once-in-a-lifetime moment here. And so very excitedly, Barbara and the other girls ran back into the cabin, they changed into their swimwear, and then a moment later, they were out frolicking in the river as the snow fell on top of them. And for hours, they just played in the river and enjoyed the snow. And the snow was kind of building up on the riverbanks, and so some of the girls went over and scooped it up and rubbed it on their faces and made snowballs, and they just had a great time. And at one point, the dance instructor came by and actually took a picture of Barbara, who was right in the middle of the river enjoying this bizarre scene. But eventually, despite how fun the snow was, the novelty of it all sort of wore off, and the girls got tired of swimming, so they changed into their regular clothes and went about their day. And over the course of the next few days, summer camp went as normal. The girls had a great time, and when summer camp ended, all the girls went home. Now, the girls never got an explanation for why it had snowed. They all just assumed it was some super rare weather event that they had been lucky enough to experience. Until 17 years later, when Barbara was 30 years old at this point, and she learned that all the other girls she had gone to the dance camp with had died. One by one, each of those girls were diagnosed with aggressive forms of cancer that killed them. Barbara was the only one who was spared. And she wouldn't get any clarification as to why that had happened until decades later in 2006, when Barbara was in her 70s, when the government finally came out and admitted the truth. It would turn out Barbara's dance instructor was correct in thinking there had been an explosion on July 16, 1945. But of course, it was not any of the cabin's heaters or anything local to the cabin or the camp. Instead, the explosion occurred 40 miles away at a US government testing site in the middle of the New Mexico desert. And the explosion that literally caused the girls to be dumped out of their beds was from the world's first ever atomic bomb being dropped. It was the Manhattan Project's Trinity test, a test that no civilians in the area had been warned about. And so after this bomb detonated, there was this nuclear fallout that rained from the sky on 500,000 people that lived within a 150-mile radius of the detonation site. And within those 500,000 people were those 10 innocent teenage girls at their dance camp. The snow that the girls played in was actually radioactive material from this nuclear fallout raining down from the sky that over the course of 17 years would give 9 of the girls various forms of cancer that would kill them. Here is the picture that the dance instructor took of Barbara posing in the middle of the river as the snow is falling all around her. As you can see, Barbara is smiling and looking up at the snow, not realizing it's literally going to kill almost everyone in that picture. As for Barbara, she did not die young. However, she would suffer from multiple cancers and illnesses, all associated with radiation exposure. The night of Friday, September 18th, 2015, a 45-year-old man named Lattori Barman stumbled down a pitch-black street in a small village in central India. Lattori was stumbling because he was very, very drunk. He and his wife had spent most of the night together out at this local fair, having loads to drink and partying, and then at some point his wife had actually broken off and gone to her parents' house in another village, but Lattori had decided to stay out and keep the fun rolling. And so once she was gone, Lattori had gone to a liquor store and had more to drink there, and then now he had finally decided he had had enough, he was extremely intoxicated, and he just wanted to get back home. And so as Lattori stumbled down this road, he could really only see maybe a foot in front of him. Not only because he was so drunk, but also because the streets in his village did not have lights, and so it was totally dark. However, this wasn't unusual for Lattori. I mean, this is where he lived. He'd walked the street many, many times and knew how to navigate without any lighting. And so he just continued walking along, business as usual. But what did strike him as odd is that, late at night here, as he's making his way home, he thought it was weird that there was a lot of people out on the road. He couldn't really see them because, again, there's no lighting, but he could definitely hear them. Like there was people sort of all over the place. And he also sort of in his intoxicated state saw some lights that, maybe were vehicles sort of moving around. So there was like more activity on this road than usual. But at the same time, this is a main road and sometimes there's lots of people and cars on it, even late at night. So this didn't really strike him as odd enough to stop and investigate. He just kept on walking towards his house. But as he's walking through with all this commotion all around him, at some point he goes to step, but instead of his foot striking the ground again, there's nothing there. And suddenly he feels himself falling and he smashes into the ground, and now truly it's pitch black. He can't see anything, and he blacks out. The following morning, a group of villagers were walking down the same street that Lattori had been on the night before, and as they were walking, now in broad daylight, they looked up ahead and they noticed something odd right in the middle of the street. And at first they had no idea what it was, and so they walked closer to it to get a better look. And as they walked up on this thing, they instantly understood what it was. And they screamed and ran to tell authorities. It would turn out the reason Lattori was hearing and seeing all these people and, vehicles on the street the night before, which seemed sort of out of place, was because there was actually a construction crew repairing potholes in that road. This road was known for being very dangerous because of these deep potholes. And Lattori, as he was stumbling along, accidentally fell into one of these deep potholes, smashed the ground, and was knocked unconscious. And because this worksite was so chaotic and there was all this, movement and there was bad lighting, none of the crew saw Lattori fall in. And Lattori, even after, coming to inside the hole, was too drunk to get out of the hole. And so at some point that night, the construction crew reached the pothole that Lattori was in. They didn't see him, and they poured molten tar into the hole and then rolled over it with a roller, all with Lattori inside the hole. And so after they were done and moved on to the next pothole, Lattori, in his final moments, tried to kind of pull himself out of this tar, but he only managed to get his hand up and out of the tar. And so the next day, the group of villagers that walked down the road, what did they see? They saw Lattori's hand poking out of the ground. Lattori's body was removed from the street and he was given a proper burial. There were 2 construction workers who were on duty on the night of Lattori's death who were ultimately arrested and charged with culpable homicide. As for Lattori's family, authorities would give them a compensation payment for Lattori's death, but it was only worth approximately $760 US. 2:30 p.m. on November 28, 2015, a man pulled into his driveway in the extremely rural city of Huron, California. He had been away overnight, and so as soon as he got out of his car, he walked right up to his porch and checked his doorknob to make sure his door was still locked. He found that it was, which was a relief, Then he unlocked it and stepped inside. However, as soon as he was inside his house, he just stopped and listened and kind of looked around. So this neighborhood that he lived in was not a safe place to live. In fact, over the past year, this guy's house had been broken into multiple times. However, he had not reported any of these break-ins to the police because he himself was wanted for felony drug possession. And so instead of getting the police involved, the man had sort of begun doing his own home security. Basically, every time he came home, he would sort of take a minute, listen, make sure nobody was in the house, and then actually sweep the house to make sure, nobody was there and that nothing had been stolen. And so as the man stood there in his doorway listening, he couldn't hear anything and nothing looked disturbed inside of his house. So he flipped on the lights, he walked into his living room and put his keys and his wallet down. And then he began doing this kind of systematic sweep through his house, checking to make sure there was nothing wrong. Checked the windows, none were broken, goes to the back door, it's still locked. He's in his kitchen, he's in, his dining room, there's nothing out of place. He did notice, however, that his mail that was sitting on one of his tables looked like maybe it had been rummaged through, but at the same time, he couldn't remember if maybe he had been kind of sloppy when he had gone over his mail before he had left the night before. So he didn't know if the mail was a sign of a break-in, but it didn't seem like it. And so after completing his sweep and feeling confident that the house was, in good order, he sat down and he relaxed. And he felt like, it had been a while since the last break-in and maybe he was being a bit too paranoid. But for now, he decided, his security protocol was good enough and he wouldn't make any changes quite yet. And he just picked up the remote, turned on the TV, and settled in for the night. However, after only a couple of minutes, the man realized his house was pretty cold and he was starting to shiver. So he stood up and he walked over and he turned on his heat. Then he sat back down on his couch. And then, about a minute later, this awful, high-pitched scream ripped through the house. It would turn out the homeowner's paranoia around break-ins was totally justified because the night before while he was gone, someone had tried to break into his home. 19-year-old Cody Caldwell had snuck onto the roof and attempted to enter this man's house through the chimney. But he got stuck about halfway down. And when the man came home and did his safety patrol and checked his house and couldn't hear or see anything, what he didn't realize was Cody was still absolutely stuck in the chimney and alive. He just wasn't making any sound. And then when the homeowner got cold and turned on the heat, what he literally did was he started an actual fire in his fireplace. And after setting this fire, Cody, who's wedged in the chimney right above this fire, began breathing in the smoke, and in his panic, he began to wiggle around and sink further and further down into this chimney, which is angled, and so he would have gotten more and more stuck until he was basically in the fire and then caught on fire. That scream was him burning alive inside of the chimney. And the man who owned the house had no idea what was going on. He just heard these screams. And then finally, when he got the fire put out and he called the police and the first responders showed up, it was already too late because Cody had died from severe burns and smoke inhalation. On the evening of January 19th, 2022, a 40-year-old mother named Anna Uskova set up a camera and some lights at the edge of a clearing in the woods in St. Petersburg, Russia. Then she focused the camera on the spot in the clearing where she, her husband, and her children were about to perform a very important religious ceremony. So to set the scene here, it was late at night, so it's dark, it was snowing, it's totally freezing. This is the dead of winter out in the middle of Russia. This is a cold, cold environment. But this is when this ceremony was done. In the dead of winter, all over Russia. This was not just something Anna's family was doing, this is like a Russian thing. On this day, all over the country, people would perform this sort of purification ritual that was designed to revitalize their bodies and souls and help them ward off evil spirits for the new year. Now, typically, Anna and her family would perform this big ceremony in a group setting with their church. But this year, Anna decided she wanted to hold this ceremony privately, with just her family kind of out in the woods by themselves. It would be more intimate, and the kids would feel, a bit more involved than they normally did. And so far, it was going great. They had found the perfect location. It was stunningly beautiful. It really felt like the best place to perform the ceremony. But it was kind of odd that when they got there, there was no other families there. They had this place to themselves, which was just crazy, but they thought, great, this is even better for us. This is gonna be the perfect ceremony. So while Anna's husband finished prepping everything they would need,
Anna hit record on the camera, and then Anna walked out from behind the camera, and you see her come into frame, and she walks over to her kids. And now her kids are going to be performing this ritual the same way Anna and her husband would be, and it's clear they're pretty nervous. Now, they've done this before, but still, this ritual is not very comfortable. It doesn't feel very good, at least in the moment. And so Anna knew this, and so she knelt down with her kids, and she kind of reassured them that they were brave, they were courageous, they could do this, and she was gonna go first. And they could see that, once mom did it, they would know that they could do it too. And so at some point, after kind of giving her kids a pep talk, Anna stood up, she walked over to the area that was designated for this ceremony, and then as the camera's rolling, she stood there, she drew a cross on her chest, then she stepped forward and kind of jumped feet first, and then disappeared. 1 second passed with no sign of Anna, and that was okay. But then 2 seconds passed and there was still no sign of Anna. And then 3 seconds passed and still no Anna. And at that point, her husband and her kids began to scream. So what Anna and her family didn't understand, or at a minimum just did not fully appreciate, was that when they did this ceremony with their church every year, the church took a lot of effort to make sure the location they chose for the ceremony, that it was totally safe. And on top of that, they often had medical personnel on standby, just in case. But Anna and her family had not done either of those things. The location they chose was no doubt stunningly beautiful, but the reason it was deserted is it was a terrible spot for this ceremony. And then also, they didn't have any medical personnel on standby. The ceremony that Anna and her family were taking part in is known as the Russian Orthodox Epiphany, and it's a type of baptism. Basically, people all over Russia at this time of the year will carve a cross-shaped hole in the ice over a body of water, and then one by one, they'll jump into the water and then emerge again, baptized, purified. And so Anna and her family had done that. They'd carved the cross in this frozen body of water. But the reason this spot was a terrible spot to do this ceremony and why it was totally deserted is because they had chosen a raging river. That yes, it's frozen, but underneath, that river is still flowing, and it's a very deep river. And so the second Anna stepped into the water feet first, she got swept away. But they didn't have a way for her to re-emerge. It's all frozen ice. And so the second she went under into the pitch black water, she was gone. And within a couple of seconds, her family is expecting her to come back up again, but of course she didn't. And so they began screaming, and Anna's husband actually leapt into the water, but he actually stopped himself really quickly because he felt that current pulling him. And so he got out, and very quickly, a search was launched for Anna, but there was no hope. They couldn't find her, and in fact, to this day, they still have not recovered her body.
A 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm going to do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures. And then all of a sudden, the ground underneath him began to shift. And it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back, scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full 30-year-old Christopher LeCun was out on his boat with his wife, his kids, and his best friend Robert just off the coast of Port St. Lucie in Florida. Throughout the day, anytime Chris or Robert were looking down from the boat and spotted a rock pile, they would throw on their scuba tanks and dive down to attempt to find lobsters. Towards the end of the day, when they were looking down into the water, they saw what they thought was a rock pile at first, but as they kept looking at it, they noticed it had lots of straight lines, indicating it could be an underwater building. Chris and Robert noticed there was a yellow buoy floating on the surface right above where this building was underwater, and they thought they should probably go over and read it, but they decided, it's inconsequential. We can just go down and check it out for ourselves. Now, if they had stopped and gone over and read the buoy first, they would have seen there was a warning on it that was telling people to stay back at least 100 feet from this underwater structure. But Robert and Chris didn't read that warning, so they put on their scuba tanks and they dove down into the water. And after only going down about 10 feet, they noticed there wasn't just one structure underwater. There were actually 3 huge structures. And so Chris and Robert looked at each other and they're totally amazed at what they're looking at. They had been scuba diving together since they were young kids, and they'd spent a lot of time in these waters, but they had never seen these before. And so they were very excited to go down and have a look. When they got down there and they were only a couple feet away from one of these structures, Chris saw that the top of the building was just a square concrete slab, and then on all 4 sides there were big concrete slabs. But at the top of each of the 4 walls of this building were what appeared to be openings. They were almost like windows at the top of the structure. And across the window was mesh all the way around, like a grate, protecting things from going into the window and into the structure. And so Chris and Robert went right up to the mesh and tried to look inside of the structure just to see what was in there. But when they looked, it was just too dark inside and there was no way to tell what was in there. And so Chris is really disheartened because he really wanted to know what was inside of this building. And so he just grabs the mesh itself and just kind of tries to tug it in one direction just to see if it would even move, to maybe create some space so he could look inside. And it very easily slid all the way to the side, revealing an opening big enough for he he and Robert to go through. And so the two of them look at each other and they just nod because they know they want to go inside and see what's in there. And so Chris went in, followed by Robert, and they found themselves inside of just this big empty space, this 70-foot by 70-foot space where there really was nothing inside of it, except down at the very bottom on one wall was this 16-foot wide opening that was the entrance to a huge tunnel. And from where Chris and Robert were at the top of the inside of the structure, they couldn't see into the tunnel. And so they decided, by looking at each other and nodding once more, that they would just go down and try to look to see if they could see through to the other side of this tunnel. And so Chris goes down first, followed by Robert, and as they start making their way down, they both start to feel a current that's pulling them straight down. And as soon as they felt that, they both intuitively knew that they didn't want to be a part of that, and they started swimming as fast as they could back up towards their exit. Robert, who was a little bit higher than Christopher, was able to escape the pull of this current and got up to the top of the inside of the structure towards the exit. Chris, on the other hand, was not able to escape this current's grasp and was actually pulled backwards into the tunnel where he disappeared. Robert had actually turned around and saw his friend get pulled into that tunnel, but he knew there was nothing he could do, and so he just turned around, swam out of the structure, and up to the boat as fast as he could to call 911. Once Chris had been pulled into this dark tunnel, he began tumbling backwards. He had no control over his body position. The current was just way too strong. And so Chris instinctively grabbed his mouthpiece and anchored it inside of his mouth, and then he grabbed his mask and did his best to keep that on his face. Because as he was tumbling, the current kept trying to pull those things off of him. As Chris tumbled through this pitch black tunnel, he began to realize that more than likely he's going to encounter some very powerful pump that's sucking this water through this pipe in the first place, or some huge turbine that has something to do with pulling the water through this pipe. And in both of those situations, once Chris reaches the end of this tunnel, he's going to get cut up and get killed. And so Chris thought about pulling his mouthpiece out to just end it right then and there to avoid this horribly violent death. But he thought about his family, he thought about his kids, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And so he just continued to hold on to his mouthpiece and his mask and just continued to tumble with no control in total darkness, having no clue where he was going. After over 5 minutes of this just nightmare situation for Chris, he suddenly sees a very small flicker of light at the very far end of the tunnel in the direction they're being pulled towards. And all he can think of is, okay, well, whatever that light is, that's the area where I'm going to get killed. There's going to be some pump or some turbine right out there. And so he's bracing himself for this terrible, violent end to his life. But as they got closer and closer and that light continued to grow, Chris got a better picture every time he would tumble around. He'd get a look, and it did not look like there were spinning blades of death or some pump in there. It actually looked like very peaceful, calm water with sunlight pushing through it. And sure enough, after he got shot out into this lit up area, the current kind of died down and stopped. Chris immediately began swimming right up towards the surface where there was actually land right in front of him. He was inside of what looked like this huge building, and he saw there were people walking around with hard hats. And so Chris just pulled himself out of the water and began yelling for help. It would turn out Chris had been pulled into a nuclear power plant's cooling system. This particular nuclear power plant used a multi-level system where instead of just pulling the water in directly into the plant where it would be cooled and there would be, a pump of death or spinning turbines or something like that, instead there was a reservoir first where the water was dumped, and then after a while that reservoir water would then get churned up into the cooling system. So Chris was just incredibly lucky that that was just the way this nuclear power plant was built, because many other nuclear power plants, if he had done what he did, he would have been killed in a really horrible way. Chris would ultimately sue the power plant, saying they didn't put up enough warning signs or enough deterrents to protect people from getting sucked into these intake pipes, and the power plant has countered by saying, we put up enough deterrents, you just went past them on purpose. As of now, it's unclear what came of that court. 46-year-old Alex Kirstich was a marine biology high school teacher by day and a documentary filmmaker by night. In July of that year, he and 3 of his friends were in Mexico working on a documentary about sea life in the Gulf of California. They had already shot a bunch of footage during the daytime, and now they needed to go out and get some nighttime footage as well. On the evening of the 25th, Alex and his 3 friends boarded a 70-foot research vessel with all of their diving and camera equipment. equipment. They waited until just before sunset to leave the harbor, and then it was a 30-minute transit to this area just north of La Paz that they had been told was very active at night. Once the ship was stopped, they threw their anchor down and then turned on these bright spotlights and aimed them into the water. And then one of the ship's crew members put a big piece of tuna onto his fishing rod and then cast it out into the water to try to lure some animals to the area. A few moments later, a black mass suddenly came up to the surface, ripped the tuna from the line, and then vanished as quickly as it appeared. Alex and his three friends didn't get a good look at it. They saw it happen, but they had no idea what it was. So they told the ship crew member to put another piece of tuna on the line, throw it out there, and see if they can get a better look at this thing. And so more tuna was put on the rod, it was cast out, and then seconds later, a black mass rushed up to the surface, grabbed the tuna, and then went back down again. But this time, with Alex and the others looking really intently at it, they picked up what looked like a red and white flash, like a strobe light on the skin of this creature as it descended down below. And they looked at each other and they thought, could it be? And so another piece of tuna was put on the fishing rod, they cast it out into the water, and this time, before anything could come up and take it, deep down below, they see a flash of red and white all over the place, like a bunch of strobe lights going off. And then dozens of these creatures rocketed to the surface, fought over this tuna, and then descended back down into the deep water. And so now the men look at each other and they're grinning because they know the red and white flashing they are seeing is a trademark of a very rare creature. It's their skin changing colors. It's how they communicate with each other. And this creature is so rare that at this time, no one had actually filmed it alive. There was only footage of it dead after it washed up on shore. And so suddenly Alex and his team are thinking, man, our documentary is about to become legendary if we can just get in there and get the footage. And so the men eagerly put on their dive equipment, got their cameras, and prepared to enter the water. Had they consulted with anyone who studied this rare creature, they would have been told that getting in the water with them was a horrible idea and could easily get them killed. These rare creatures are called Humboldt squids, and they are 8-foot long apex predators that live in the deepest parts of the ocean. Because they almost never come up to the shallow waters, we know very little about them. What we do know is that, like all other squids, they have 8 arms along with 2 long tentacles that have all these suckers on it, and inside of the suckers are these teeth, these little daggers that they use to latch onto their prey, and then they pull their prey in towards their center, and at their center is this opening. It's their mouth, and it's called a beak, and it literally looks like a bird's beak. It's this hard thing that sits there and opens and shuts, and they use it to bite into their prey. And then inside of their beak is their tongue, and on their tongue are hundreds of sharp little daggers like more teeth that they also use to shred their prey. Typically, these jumbo squid will sneak underneath their prey and then suddenly shoot up, grab them with their 2 tentacles, and then drag them down to the deeper water where they feel safe, and then they begin the horrifyingly slow process of eating their prey alive because they have a gag reflex that prevents them from eating quickly. Humboldt squids are very intelligent, they're very social, and they're very aggressive towards humans, especially when they are in a large group or when they are eating. But of course, Alex and his 3 friends are not thinking about this. They're just eager to get into those jumbo squid infested waters and get this footage. And so they give each other the final okays. They're ready, their equipment's good to go, and they slip off the side of the boat into the water. Once they were in the water, they sank down to 30 feet, at which point they spread out around the squid that were still darting up to the edge of the boat to try to get more tuna. After a few minutes of Alex and his buddies taking this great footage of these squids, a 14-foot shark suddenly comes into the mix and tries to eat the tuna off the side of the boat. But ironically, on its way out after not getting any tuna, the shark got its tail fins stuck on the actual hook and then became bait for the Humboldt squids. And seconds later, the squids began ripping the shark apart. And so Alex and his 3 friends decided to move closer to the drama to get some great footage. As Alex is right up next to this drama unfolding, he feels himself suddenly sinking in the water. And he's kind of fixated on getting this shot, so he's not really worried about why he's sinking. He's thinking maybe my buoyancy compensator compensators off, maybe my weights are too heavy. But when he looks down, he realizes in horror, a Humboldt squid has wrapped one of its tentacles around his right swim fin. And so he instinctively begins kicking the squid's tentacle with his left leg. He gets it to release him, and in a panic, Alex begins swimming back up towards the surface. But he's still 40 feet away at this point from the boat. And at this point, the other squid had been alerted to Alex as now being considered prey. And so as Alex is going up, from behind, another squid comes up and wraps its tentacle around his neck. And his neck was the only area on his body that was not protected by his neoprene wetsuit. And so the daggers inside of these suckers on this tentacle dug into his neck, all around his neck. So his neck's being cut into and he's being strangled and being pulled down by this squid. And so Alex begins punching and squeezing and pulling on this tentacle, fighting for his life. And he manages to get this squid, the second one, also to release him. But by now he's been pulled down to 50 feet. He's got a ways to go to get back to the boat. And the other squid are all coming over. They're converging on him because they're all communicating that here's our prey, here's our other meal. And so Alex tries to swim as fast as he can back to the boat, but he only made it a few feet before another Humboldt squid darted up and came right up to his face, wrapped both tentacles around his entire head, blinding him, and he immediately felt the beak pressed up against his face, and it was opening and closing, trying to bite him, but it was biting down on his dive mask that was basically saving him from having his skull crushed by this squid. The squid became frustrated because it's not digging into Alex's flesh, and so it readjusted its grip on him by sliding down to his midsection, where immediately it begins pulling him down violently in these pulsing bursts. And so all Alex starts doing is punching and hitting and doing everything he can to get this thing off of him. And then for some reason, it does release him. Maybe it was just so frustrated that it could not puncture into him. And so Alex is now down to about 60 feet, and he starts swimming as fast as he can with all these squids all around him. But for some reason, none of them attacked him. And so Alex swims up to the boat, and before he actually gets on board, he looks down back into the water, and there's just dozens of these squids that are flashing red and white at each other, just kind of hovering in the water, not making any move towards him. It was like they were just watching him. Alex sprinted up that ladder, got into the boat, and shortly after, his three friends came out of the water as well. They were unharmed. Alex had deep cuts all around his neck from where the tentacles had driven their teeth into his throat, but besides that, he was physically okay. Mentally, he was a train wreck and was very traumatized from this event, as you could imagine. Today, his encounter with the jumbo squids is a thing of legend in the diving community. A cave in Chihuahua, Mexico, punctured through the ground and discovered this flooded cavern. After pumping the water out and stepping inside of this cavern, they were amazed to see these massive gypsum crystals that had formed on the walls and the ceiling all over this cave. Although the crystals were beautiful, they were far less valuable than what these miners were after, which was silver. So instead of trying to, mine out these crystals, they told the locals in the area that they had found this cave and that they really ought to come down here and protect it because it's this amazing natural wonder. And so for the next 100 years, the locals in Chihuahua, Mexico, basically kept this cave that they nicknamed the Cave of Swords under lock and key so that no one would go in there and destroy these amazing crystals. Fast forward to the year 2000, and two men are inside of this mine, not the Nika mine where the Cave of Swords is located, but a mine that was right up against it. And they're drilling down, and they're actually at the same level of where the Cave of Swords is located. And they don't know it yet, but they're drilling underneath the Cave of Swords. And they eventually puncture into the rock, revealing this underground flooded cavern. Now, these two men are not tracking that this is right underneath the Cave of Swords. So they're not thinking there could be crystals inside of this flooded cavern. They're thinking there could be silver down there. So after pumping all the water out of this cavern, they crawl down inside and it opens up into this massive cavern with these enormous crystals coming out of the ceiling, the walls, everywhere. And they are like 10 times, 15 times bigger than any of the biggest crystals inside of the Cave of Swords. These are literally the biggest crystals in the world, and this cavern looks like Superman's Fortress of Solitude. It's this unbelievable landscape. This new cave would be dubbed the Giant Crystal Cave, and like its counterpart, the Cave of Swords, it would be handed over to locals to protect. Now, you'd think people would be lining up like crazy to get inside either of these two caves to see these natural wonders. But the truth is, Nobody wants to go inside of these caves because they're death traps. Even though both of these caves have had the water drained out of them, their humidity level is still 100%, which means if you're in there too long in either of these two caves, you run the risk of your lungs starting to fill with water, effectively drowning you. In fact, scientists speculate that it would take about 10 minutes for this to happen to you if you were inside one of these caves, assuming you were not wearing a special breathing device that was pumping dry air back into you. But even if you were wearing these special air tanks, the cave would still kill you in about an hour because the temperature exceeds 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you combine the extreme heat with the humidity and the tight enclosed nature of an underground cave, you have a natural oven that if you stay in there too long, it will cook you alive. So the only people that go inside of these caves are researchers that wear all the special equipment, and they only go inside for a couple of minutes at most. But in 2001, so 1 year after the discovery of the Big Crystal Cave, one of the workers who helped drain out the Big Crystal Cave decided, you know what? I want a crystal for myself. And so using his understanding of the mine and his access to this particular section of the mine, he made his way down and got inside of the Big Crystal Cave. Now, the only special equipment he had was a saw, because he figured he could get in there and saw off a piece of one of these crystals and get out of there in just a couple of minutes, certainly well before anything bad would happen to him. So he gets inside, he identifies the crystal he wants, and he starts sawing off the bottom of this crystal. But it dislodges a huge chunk of the crystal that falls on him. Now, when it fell on him, that didn't kill him, but it pinned him inside of this cave. At this point, reality must have sunk in very quickly for this guy. He didn't tell anyone where he was going because what he was doing was illegal, and he knows that nobody checks inside of these caves to see if people are trapped or stuck, because they don't expect people to go into these caves, and they're off limits. A couple of days later, researchers went down into Big Crystal Cave, and they discovered this guy still pinned underneath the big crystal he had cut from the ceiling. It was unclear whether he had died from drowning or from being cooked alive, but either way, he was deceased. To this day, Big Crystal Cave and the Cave of Swords are strictly off limits